Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today in such large numbers for the 2020 Latornell Student Symposium, virtual edition, hopefully the last one. My name is Nick Brunet. I'm the Latornell Professor in Environmental Stewardship in the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development at the University of Guelph's Ontario Agricultural College, and one of your hosts today. This event is supported by the University of Guelph and Conservation Ontario. The 2020 Student Symposium was created and designed to celebrate diversity in all its forms and its contributions to ensuring that our ecosystems are able to thrive, protect, feed, and nurture us now and into the future, despite the destructive forces that constantly threaten their existence and, importantly, our own. As an integral part of his land ethic, Aldo Leopold found that by seeing land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. Developing this thinking community, as he called it, requires that we engage in thoughtful dialogue with each other, inviting a diversity of perspectives, experiences, and backgrounds. Similarly, in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer claims that knowing that you love the earth changes you, activates you to defend and protect and celebrate it. But when you feel that the earth loves you in return, that feeling transforms the relationship from a one-way street into a sacred bond. These messages are more important than ever as our own government attempts to undermine our efforts as a conservation community. Despite scientific evidence, despite common sense, despite what the Indigenous peoples of this land have told us for generations. The current human health crisis is further evidence that we need to find creative and novel ways to work with our planet, not against it. With this, I introduce you to another co-host, Jessica, a doctoral student in the geography department at the University of Guelph, who will deliver the land acknowledgement. Importantly, reminding us of our responsibility to the people who were here prior to our arrival and who remain the keepers and protectors of this place most of us as settlers on this land call home. Jessica.
Thanks, Nick, for the opening remarks and introduction, and good morning, everyone. We have a lot of people registered today, 153, which is great. My name is Jessica Lukowiecki, and I'm a third-year geography PhD student at the University of Guelph. And I'm also the student secretary for the Latornell Steering Committee. And today I will also be one of the moderators for our sessions, so you'll see me popping on and off the screen throughout the day. Recognizing that we all find ourselves in different places today, we will be acknowledging the land upon which the University of Guelph was built, given the university's close connection to the Latornell Symposium. With that, I invite each of you to consider the land upon which you find yourselves today, its rich history and current realities, and how you yourself came to be there. The Dish with One Spoon covenant speaks to our collective responsibility to steward and sustain the land and environment in which we live and work, so that all people, present and future, may benefit from the sustenance that it provides. We acknowledge that the University of Guelph resides in the ancestral and treaty lands of several Indigenous people, including the Attawandaran people and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we recognize and honor our Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis neighbors. We acknowledge that much of the work presented here today has occurred on these traditional lands, so that we might work to build lasting partnerships that respect, honor, and value the culture, traditions, and wisdom of those who have lived here since time immemorial. The format of our webinar today is 2 keynote speakers, followed by 6 student spotlight sessions, highlighting the noteworthy graduate student research being done in the field of social and ecological conservation. There will be the opportunity for attendees to ask questions throughout each session, and then an open-ended short discussion of curated questions from the floor, also known as the Q&A box, as contributed by our participants. Just a few housekeeping notes for this morning before we get started. First, all of our attendees are muted, so you will not be able to speak or come on video. You will find a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to ask any of our panelists a question, please type it in the box and press enter to have it posted. If you could include which panelists you would like to address, that would also be really helpful for us as well. And you can upvote a question you like by pressing the thumbs up icon. We will be reviewing the questions and we'll have time to pose a few of them to our panelists. And also please feel free to interact with others in the webinar using the chat box. I see that some of you already are, which is great. And to our panelists, a reminder to use your mute button when you are not speaking, and of course to unmute yourself when you are. Finally, the webinar is being recorded so that others who were not able to attend will be able to listen in at their leisure. And with that being said, I will be handing it over to Angela, who is our second moderator, to introduce our keynote speakers for today. So welcome, Angela, and over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Latornell Student Symposium. Thank you so much for tuning in today. And my name is Angela Ascension, and I am the student organizer and helping to moderate today's event. A little background on me. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a Filipina-Canadian master's student in rural planning and development and international development studies at the University of Guelph. And I'm proud to be a part of this organizing team as we created the 2020 Latornell Student Symposium with aims to emphasize interconnectedness and sustainability by creating this platform which highlights diversity, equity, and inclusion in conservation research and practice. So without further ado, it is a pleasure to introduce our two keynote speakers this morning, Dawn Pearson and Carrie-Ann Charles. Our first keynote is Dawn Pearson. Dawn retired as general manager of the Lower Thames Valley Conservation Authority in December of 2017, following a long career with several conservation authorities beginning in 1976. Before joining the Lower Thames in 2013, Dawn served nearly 8 years as general manager of Conservation Ontario, the umbrella group that represents Ontario's 36 conservation authorities. His tenure at Conservation Ontario focused on the development of drinking water source protection plans for 19 regions throughout Ontario and developing the relationship between conservation authorities and the province. With Dawn's years of expertise in conservation authorities, you can see why Dawn is a natural start for us this morning. So welcome, Dawn, over to you.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Angela, for the introduction. It's really a privilege to be given the opportunity to participate in this seminar and really to try to bring forward some of the reasons why Art Latornell's name continues to be associated with important long-running conservation symposium. Many people have heard the name Art, but fewer and fewer have personal firsthand experience with Art in terms of a relationship. In my own career, I really began as a student in the early 70s, and I had the privilege of meeting Art, but sadly I was not among those who worked closely with him, although I think one of the interesting aspects of Art's legacy was that those people that he mentored in themselves developed an appreciation of the importance of really establishing an enduring ethic in the people that they were associated with. And I think that's an important aspect of Art's legacy. So I'd like to spend just a little bit of time on acquainting participants with who Art was, and more importantly, why Art's name and his legacy is one that we believe should continue to be celebrated as having enduring influence. Of course, one of the obvious things was upon Art's death, he left some $2 million to the University of Guelph as an endowment. And as part of that gift, he specifically asked that it be used to enable students to attend conferences or courses offered by educational institutions, and to pay grants to foster visiting lectureships, student exchanges, and similar education programs to natural resources. So Art had an enduring belief in the value of education and the importance of developing our youth. So really, even more than his financial legacy, Art, through his passion, his vision, values, and his philosophy, nurtured and mentored a generation of conservationists who embraced his vision and his belief that the future depended on a succession of generations of passionate, like-minded men and women. Art was really ahead of his time in practicing empowerment decades before the concept really became widespread in organizational behavioral science. So it's this legacy that really motivates the effort to keep art's name alive within the conservation community and relevant nearly 3 decades after his death. There are some tremendous resources available online for people who wish to get further information about art, including an excellent biography that was done on behalf of the University of Guelph by Angela Booth, and there are some references that'll be posted here for your information. But just brief personal biography. He was born in 1923 and raised on a family farm near Meaford, Ontario. So he was old enough to have experienced the Great Depression and also World War II. The latter delayed his higher education, so he didn't enter the Ontario Agricultural College at Guelph until 1946. So he really was a mature student before he started, and he graduated in 1950. Following his graduation, he spent a couple of years with the Department of Agriculture in Ontario as a fruit and vegetable inspector before enrolling at Michigan State University's master's program in agricultural extension. Art came back to Ontario in 1953 and was hired as a field officer for what was then known as the conservation branch of the Department of Planning and Development, and that's where his 24-year career with Ontario's conservation authorities really got underway. As a field officer, which later these people were known as resources managers, Art initially spent his time providing support to conservation authorities. And in 1957, he was actually appointed full-time to the newly created Metropolitan Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, which was an amalgamation of several authorities in the Greater Toronto Area. And there, Art concentrated on developing information and education programs, land use, forestry, really laying the foundation for these programs through preparation and presentation of educational materials to the public. He pioneered tours for watershed or for school groups throughout the watershed. And he was really noted for having special skills in being able to communicate at a level of the students without talking down to them. These tours became so popular that within years they were doing 20 to 30 of these tours a day. And eventually their popularity led to the expansion into camping situations at various locations throughout the Metropolitan Toronto and Region Conservation Authority's watershed, and ultimately the development of the first conservation field center at Albion Hills in 1963. So Art's experience in developing these programs at MTRC stayed with him really for the rest of his career. And he never lost his enthusiasm for developing and promoting the educational component of conservation, especially for young people. In 1959, Art was promoted to being the head of the branch land use survey section, and he held that position for 4 years. And in that, he was responsible for organizing, planning, and administering the land use component of the watershed studies, which in the early years, the government of Ontario undertook very comprehensive studies throughout all the watersheds, which really became the watershed plan for those authorities. But to do those, he relied heavily on hiring university students to carry out the field work every summer. He enjoyed teaching the conservation basics to young people, and he soon found working with young adults to be quite inspiring. One of the students noted that although he was very busy in the business of the branch, he always took an active interest in us. To students working with him, he embodied the spirit of conservation, and he was the leading reason that many people went into conservation work. In 1963, Art was appointed the head of field services for the Conservation Authorities branch, and his job there was to hire and supervise 25 field officers that serviced the ever-expanding network of conservation authorities, which by then numbered 30 He led by example, chose excellent people, and used his skills for instilling passion for his job and people. And one of the key things was he gave them exposure and recognition for their accomplishments. Throughout the 60s and 70s, Art maintained close liaison with universities, especially Guelph, primarily for the recruitment of staff, but also to keep himself in touch with new developments in resource management. He was an occasional lecturer and guest speaker for campus groups, and he assisted in organizing conferences and seminars. He actually played a key role in developing the curriculum for a new undergraduate program in resources management at the University of Guelph. During this period also, Art broke with tradition and recruited the first geographers and biologists and resources managers in training. Another of his accomplishments was actually the hiring of some of the first women as resources manager trainees, which in those days was actually a shock to what was known as a bit of an old boys club. And today, Art would be really pleased to see the number of women who've risen to senior positions within the Conservation Authority's program. Another of Art's important legacies was the development of the Junior Conservationist Award Program, otherwise known as JCAP. It began in the mid-60s, and it was Art's brainchild and something that he was very proud of. It was designed to provide the new Department of Energy and Resources Management, which succeeded Planning and Development, with its own version of what Lands and Forests had in the Junior Rangers program. The objective was to provide an opportunity for talented high school students to increase their knowledge of the natural environment and its management. Art wanted to move away from strictly a forestry focus, so the JCAP was conceived as a comprehensive working learning experience, providing tremendous exposure to conservation issues and planning. Art emphasized the award aspect. Enrollment was limited to 24 students every summer, and they were selected from nominations submitted by sponsoring organizations, including schools. Initially, it was for boys only, but very soon it became fully co-ed, and the participants first received orientation and training as a group. They were then divided into 4 study teams, each tackling a research project that had been submitted by a local conservation authority. And the study teams were then assigned a university student as leader and a resource person. Once again, it reflected Art's strategy for working at the grassroots level. In this case, talented people at a very young age, providing solid information and a framework in which to work, and then giving them responsibility and latitude to make decisions and take action. One of the major benefits, of course, of this program was, in addition to producing amazing research results and studies, was it served as a testing ground for future employees. And many people working in the CAs and through resource-related jobs actually got their start as junior conservationists. And three come to mind: Tom Prout, Dick Hunter, and Joan Bell. And a little bit later on, I'll offer some testimonials for them. So Art was obviously well known and respected throughout Ontario, but also internationally as a very forward thinker. He was an active member of the Agricultural Institute of Canada, Canadian Nature Federation, Canadian Arctic Resources Commission, and as a professional agrologist, he was a charter member of the Ontario Institute of Professional Agrologists. He became an Ontario director for the Canadian Water Resources Association and was a director and member of the Federation of Ontario Naturalists. He also served on several committees of the Soil and Water Conservation Society at provincial and international levels, and eventually became the first Canadian president of the International Society for Soil and Water Conservation, a very prestigious honor. But despite his numerous professional achievements, many would argue that Art had his greatest impact through his influence in teaching of students and colleagues. And just a few thoughts from some of those people. Tom Prout said he was gentle, kind, patient, at the same time decisive without being a micromanager. He gave employees opportunities and supported those who worked hard and achieved goals. He was a believer in the movement and considered it a worthy calling, an attitude that was constantly infused into new recruits. And Jim Anderson goes on to say, the pioneers of Art's generation understood the value of innovation and supported trying new approaches. before anybody was using language like thinking outside the box. They believed in the ability of new conservationists to move forward with their ideas, understood people, and understood how to motivate them. Art used a very loose style of supervision, but he knew how to help people find their own way to answer questions without providing the answers for him. And Dick Hunter says, art played a major role in influencing my choice of career and all of my jobs over the years, for which I'm truly thankful. He was quiet, honest, intelligent gentleman who spoke softly but eloquently about the wise use and management of our natural resources. In any conversation, he was focused totally on you, listening carefully to your thoughts, questions, or issues. And at some point, he'd offer pearls of wisdom that didn't solve your problem, but steered you in a direction that helped find the right answer on your own. And at the same time, he was a friend and guiding force for so many young people over the years, many of us trying our very best to emulate this great man. And he made sure that people got recognition for their accomplishments. He was a mentor long before it became in vogue. And Joan Bell says, art fostered a sense of cause, engendering a commitment to the Conservation Authorities movement, and we still feel that dedication today. So I think what is most obvious about art's legacy is the passion for the work, but also the value that he had for young people bringing into the program. And I think it's really that legacy, the importance of nurturing, of mentoring, of really bringing people along, but also helping them stand on their own 2 feet, not providing the answers, but giving them wide latitude in which to work, to try new ideas, to fail. And so in that respect, I think Art Latornell is very worthy of having its name associated with the conferences and seminars that are really dedicated toward the development and training of a new generation of conservationists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Don. That was a wonderful foundation for our audience. And it's a pleasure to have had this opportunity to learn more about Art and the legacies and great impact that he's made in conservation work throughout the years in Canada and internationally. It's really great. And if you'd like to learn more about Art Latornell, check out the links Don provided in the chat box. So now I am excited to introduce our next keynote speaker, Carrie Ann Charles. Carrie Ann is a member of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation and the Environmental Partnership Coordinator for Cambium Indigenous Professional Services. She is proud to have been able to serve her community for over 17 years, working in various capacities such as bylaw development and implementation, waste management, housing, environmental project coordination and management, as well as serving a term on council. Over the past decade, Carrie Ann has dedicated herself to learning about and upholding her responsibility as an Indigenous person to protect and preserve Mother Earth, and at the same time dedicated herself to sharing this knowledge to ensure sustainability and balance for future generations. It's a pleasure to have you here, Carrie Ann. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Angela. I'm going to share my screen here. So, Anine Bojo, I hope that everybody can see that screen there. So Anine Bojo, as Angela said, my name is Carrie Ann Charles. Minogija, Carrie Ann Charles Dishnakaz, Georgina Island Dunjiba, Anishna Bekwe Endau. Again, hello, good morning. My name is Carrie Ann Charles, and I'm from the Georgina Island First Nation. I am of the Wolf Clan, and I'm a proud Indigenous woman. I do not speak my language fluent, but have been learning words over the last few years and can string this sentence together almost kind of flawlessly. Learning my language is a goal that I hope to achieve at some point in my life. I'm also the Environment Partnership Coordinator for Cambium Indigenous Professional Services, as we like to call it, SIPS, and have been a member of the SIPS team since 2017, September 2017, which is an Indigenous owned and completely Indigenous staffed environmental consulting organization, which is unique even in this day and age. I am very excited and honored to be here to speak with you all today at the 2020 Latornell Student Symposium, as we recognize diversity as being a foundation of our ecosystems and societies. I would like to acknowledge that I am privileged to be speaking to you from my own territory, the territory of the Williams Treaty First Nations. and I'm also very humbled to have been asked to speak on this topic. Like many of you, I wish that we were able to be holding this conference in person, but I hope that today will help to fill the void that we are all feeling right now in being able to connect with one another, to share ideas, knowledge and wisdom, laughter and stories, and that we approach the end of 2020. And as we approach the end of 2020, we reflect on the past year and the importance of such connection. And in doing so, we can manifest a different yet great future together from this point forward. 2020 is the 27th year of the Latornell Conservation Symposium, in which I have been grateful to be part of the steering committee for over the past 4 years. Dawn has elegantly told you the story about its origin and the great founder, Art Latornell, and I've been asked to tell you about my story and how I ended up speaking with you today. I've really thought hard about what I would say today because I have so much to tell and I have only been given a half hour to do so. I also wanted to try and make sure that the story that I told would have a connection to as many people as possible and hopefully everyone. So here we go. As mentioned, I am from the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation, where I've grown up and lived most of my life. My dad is a member of the community, but I also have family connections in Nawash Unceded First Nation, which is where his mom is from. I don't know any of those family stories or any of my relatives from that side, but it is on my bucket list to connect one day. My mom is not Indigenous and is actually Newfie. Both my grandparents from my mom's side are straight from Newfoundland, which makes me what I call a Newfie Indian, and what I also call the best of both worlds. I have yet to make it to Newfoundland either, and it is also on my bucket list of things to accomplish. I believe this mixed race has been a big influence and guide in my life, as it has been a privilege to be able to see and live in two very contrasting yet brilliant worlds. I have 4 siblings, 2 sisters and a brother that are older than me, and a younger brother, as well as a plethora of nieces and nephews who are all of mixed blood and race and who most live in our community. We actually have a pretty much our own little subdivision in our community, which at most times is good, but sometimes not so good. I also have 2 awesome kids of my own, Liam, who is 21, and Cole, who is 16, and who at the age of 14 identified as transgender. I give credit to all of them as well in guiding and influencing the path that I have been pursuing, and with the passion and intent that I pursue my path. Although my path has not been simple, I consider myself extremely fortunate to have been able to grow up in community as well as outside of my community. And until as recent as the past 10 years or so, I never really understood what pursuing a path meant, nor did I really have an idea of what I was passionate about. I owe that realization to my family, but also to my whole community for entrusting me to take on so many leadership roles throughout the past 20 years. I am not an academic. I did, although, graduate high school with honors, and at one time pursued a career in accounting in the late 90s, but found that accountants, although great people, were not my people, and the repetitiveness of such a career was something that could possibly drive me crazy. Fortunately, I got pregnant with my eldest and dropped out, which led me to building a house and working for my community at the age of 21. I actually have no schooling in the environmental field at all, and everything that I've learned and the knowledge that I share is by pursuing the passion that I have to do good for the better of all. I do have a college diploma in business administration and a human resource certificate that I earned doing online courses between 2009 and 2011 while working full-time and raising 2 kids. Being a young woman and wanting to support my family, my first real job in my community was with our youth who were at risk as the program coordinator. My job entitled coordinating activities for them that would help improve their self-esteem as well as build practical skills such as resume writing. I also was hired to coordinate and run several of our summer camps, which employed a lot of these youth who then worked with our younger kids, which allowed them to be seen as role models. Preceding this work, I also worked in our very first infant toddler daycare, as well as the preschool aged kids, and on and off for several years as a fill-in and in contract positions within our daycare. I've held many contract and proposal funded positions in my community over the years, including, as mentioned by Angela, bylaw development and enforcement, which I developed, implemented, and enforced a multitude of bylaws within my community, in which my husband pointed out to me most recently that the acronym is DIE, which is also pronounced die. I also developed relationships and partnerships both inside and out my community to do so, which was not an easy task, but led me to being elected to our chief and council in 2007 at the age of 27. During my time on council, I was responsible for several portfolios, some of which Angela had mentioned in my introduction within my community, including housing, waste management, recreation, water treatment, our radio station, as well as sharing the transportation portfolio, all of which at the time I had very little knowledge about. But being as passionate and persistent as I am, I was able to educate myself and have the people who are working in these areas, both within and outside the community, support me enough to understand enough to be able to advocate for, support, and assist the people working in these areas, often taking on many tasks myself to ensure that our community members were being offered the best programs and infrastructure possible. Which again was no easy task, and to this day is still no easy task for those people in those positions. During my term on council, I was also fortunate enough to be able to learn about and be involved in the Coldwater Narrows land claim, which is the biggest land claim settlement in Canada. Finally being settled in 2012, after 30 years of negotiations with the federal government, this was really the first time that I started to learn about my Indigenous history, the true history of my Indigenous identity, even though I grew up on reserve in my community. For those of you that don't know about this claim, I strongly suggest that you go research it. I only served a 2-year term. In 2009, the legislation under the Indian Act, and for those of you who don't know what the Indian Act is, it is actual legislation that governs how First Nations live, even in the present day, and is something else that I would recommend that you research. This legislation was changed to allow off-reserve community members to run and become elected members of council. Previously, you had to be a member living in community in order to do so. And one of our respected elders, and a respected elder of mine, and my best friend's actually mom, who was also a former counselor, ran and beat me by 1 vote. Yes, 1 vote. I love this story, and it's a true story. I was very disappointed and upset at the time, but that loss had led me down the path that I walk today, which is working in the environment field. A path in which I've been able to make so much more difference, not only in my community and for my people, but both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples alike. Although I love the time that I spent in politics and the challenges along with the opportunities that it presented me, I also realized that those people were also not my people. With me not getting into council, and because of the success that I achieved in previous positions in my community, including the development and implementation of a waste management program within our community, and a successful development and implementation of a building bylaw, amongst other related environmental undertakings, the position of environment coordinator was created and I was hired on full time.
Hi, Carrie Ann. Sorry, did you want to play your next presentation?
Oh, sorry, yes.
It's going amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the reminder. I'm not tech savvy again. Thank you again. Upon receiving this new position, due to my experience in working in so many other capacities, I knew there was a lot that needed to be done, but much like many of my previous positions, I was not very knowledgeable about how to do what needed to be done, and there was not the resources to be able to undertake the many tasks and challenges that I now faced. But I was eager as ever to take them on and make a difference for and in my community. With this new challenge, I had to do a lot of reflecting, a lot of learning and understanding in regards to all of the different aspects of society, and bridge that with my newfound knowledge of the bleak history of my Indigenous roots. I knew there were programs and resources available outside of our community, but at the time, did not understand why our community was not a part of what was going on, nor did I really understand why we did not have the resources to be able to undertake the needed projects to protect and preserve the environment within our community. So I started asking questions, pursuing relationships, collaborations, and partnerships that were never previously pursued, or at least pursued with intent. It is in this position where I also started to learn more about my Indigenous identity and what that meant in terms of protecting and preserving our environment, our Mother, the Earth, and all she provides, as well as the importance of sharing this knowledge with others so that we can work together to ensure that she's protected and preserved in a sustainable way so that she can be enjoyed by our future generations. And this is what I continue to do today. I continue to learn about my Indigenous roots, about my culture and tradition, and the knowledge that we hold in regards to the important and intimate connections that are all around us, about the many beings that have so much to teach us in our natural environment, and continue to share this knowledge with others. I also continue to learn about the many human beings and the connections that we have to each other and the important role that we play fitting into this beautiful landscape. And I strive to assist in connecting us to one another, and to create opportunities for us to share, learn, and grow with each other so that balance can be restored to her, in which sustains us, Mother Earth. The slides that I've been reminded to show you that you've been seeing during this time, I hope have helped to tell my story as well, as I've been speaking about it. These pictures depict some of the many projects, peoples, relationships, and connections that I've been so very fortunate to make over the past decade. I've met a great many people who I've not only learned from and have been able to share knowledge with, but have been privileged to be able to create opportunities for and learn alongside, while also opening up such opportunities to others so that many are learning together. I hope that you have also seen in the photos that many of them are youth. I never really realized the amount of time and the many youth that I was able to connect and share with during my time working in my community until I made the hard decision to leave my community and join the SIPS team, where I've also been lucky to be able to still work in my own community at some capacity, but also in other communities where I've been able to share my knowledge and champion the importance of building what I term respectful, reciprocal relationships with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and peoples. But just as important, if not more important, I have also been able to continue to work with the youth and to advocate and create opportunities for our youth to learn, share, contribute, and create those relationships as they, which many of you are our future. Art Latornell advocated for this as well, as you can see through the legacy of the Latornell Conservation Symposium and the many programs that stem from that. I often take on more than I can chew, but see the urgent need to assist in the coming together and the bridging of knowledge as our environment rapidly degrades and our relationship with her, as well as with each other, also quickly deteriorates. With the privilege of being both Indigenous as well as non-Indigenous, I have strived and continued to strive and will continue to strive to be able to create safe places to get to know one another, take perspectives of many, and help others understand, or at least try to understand, the importance of such. This, I believe, is one of the reasons why I was asked to sit on the Latornell Steering Committee, as well as one of the reasons that I agreed to do so. My connection with the Latornell Conservation Symposium is very intimate. It was actually my very first speaking engagement in my role as environment coordinator for my community. where I was asked to share my experiences and knowledge and programs that our community had been participating in the preservation and protection of our mother, the earth. This appointment or request, recruitment to the steering committee was made possible through the many connections and relationships that I was able to build in seeking out and undertaking the work and tasks that needed to be done within my community in my role. One of the key people that I would like to speak about is Andy Pellin, who at the time worked for the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority and was one of the very first contacts that opened up opportunities such as this for me as we worked together in various capacities with the youth and being able to have the Conservation Authority and my community get to know each other through various projects with shared resources and capacity, which projects in my community would never otherwise have been able to be pursued because of the fact that we did not have the capacity and resources. Through this relationship with the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority, I was also able to branch out and start to create other relationships. One being with the Lake Simcoe, one being with the Conservation Ontario, and a relationship that I hold very near and dear today, and that I have and will continue to pursue projects that help to rebuild the respectful reciprocal relationships that I hope can be achieved with the Indigenous communities and conservation authorities within Ontario. I believe that and have started to pursue and have made the pursuing of those relationships a passion of mine, because I believe that the conservation authorities, as well as the Indigenous communities, have lots in common and share the same values. A few of the projects that I'm currently working on with the conservation authorities is cultural awareness programs, in which several of the conservation authorities, after the promotion and support by Conservation Ontario to implement cultural awareness within some of the within some of the conservation authorities, has led to other projects that I hope will continue into the future, where relationships are being identified, but not only just identified, but strengthened and built upon through projects of stewardship and conservation. Sorry, this is supposed to go to another screen here. That is not. My technical difficulties.
It's Kate.
I did. It's there it goes. Thank you, Mario. So as I wrap up, a few things to share with you as we continue down our life paths and our journey together to create an inclusive, protected, preserved, and sustainable future, not only for ourselves, but for our next 7 generations. I truly believe that we are all here for a reason. We all have gifts that we are given by the Creator to share, and it is up to us to seek those gifts out and share those gifts with others. We need to stop competing for things or withholding things that we know will be beneficial to the collective. As one of my elders says, we need to stop thinking about our communities as commodities and start rebuilding and reconnecting with Mother Earth and putting her needs before our wants. We need to understand that others have different values and perspectives, and that this does not mean that one is better than another, but means that in sharing of those different values and perspectives, we can help to ensure sound decision-making for future. We need to listen to our peers, and not only with an open mind, but also with an open heart, and ensure that you are really trying to understand different perspectives so that you are basing decisions on as much information as possible. Also listen to what our other peers are telling us, our relatives, as we Indigenous people call them, which are the beings, the plants, the animals, the winged ones, the swimmers, and the flyers, and everything else in between. The environment and all that live within have much to teach us, and we have much to learn from them, especially when it comes to diversity and the importance of diversity. Just like Mother Earth is filled with beings of all shapes and sizes that are all connected and have purpose, so is our society, and we have to all come together in partnership, understanding, and mutual respect to ensure a healthy, sustainable future for all. We need to undertake all of our endeavors with passion and intent, thinking outside the box, as Art Latornell was doing before his time, and challenging things that you perceive as not right. Going with your gut, as this is how change is invoked. To help in doing so, if you use the simple yet complex principles that are the guiding principles of life of many Indigenous peoples and are called the 7 grandfather teachings of humility, courage, love, wisdom, respect, and truth, Minobamadzewin, or a good life, which is a good life for all, is attainable. The 7 grandfather teachings encompasses the morals, values, structures, ceremonial practices, and spiritual beliefs of the Anishinaabe people. The teachings also ensure the survival of the people and is a reflection of what we all strive for in life, which is to live a good life, or, as mentioned, Minobamadzewin. If you strive to live your life following these 7 principles, a good life is obtainable. Humility is represented by the wolf. For the wolf, life is lived for his pack, and the ultimate shame is to be outcast. Humility is to know that you are a sacred part of creation. Live life selflessly and selfishly. Respect your place and carry your pride with your people, and praise the accomplishments of all, like Art Latornell did. Do not become arrogant and self-important. Find balance within yourself and all living things. Courage is represented by the bear. The mother bear has the courage and strength to face her fears and challenges while protecting her young. The bear also shows us how to live a balanced life with rest, survival, and play. To face life with bravery is to know courage. Find your inner strength to face the difficulties of life and the courage to be yourself. Defend what you believe in and what is right for your community, family, and self. Make positive choices and have conviction in your decisions. Face your fears to allow yourself to live your life. Honesty is represented by the Sasquatch. He understands who he is and how to walk in his life. He reminds us to be ourselves and not someone who we are not. An honest person is said to walk tall like a Sasquatch, as he accepts himself and knows how to use his gifts. He does not seek the power, speed, or beauty of others. He uses what he has been given to survive and thrive. To walk through life with integrity is to know honesty. Be honest with yourself, recognize and accept who you are, accept and use the gifts you have been given. Do not seek to deceive yourself or others. Wisdom is represented by the beaver because he uses his natural gift wisely for his survival. The beaver also alters his environment in an environmentally friendly and sustainable way for the benefit of his family. To cherish knowledge is to know wisdom. Use your inherent gifts wisely and live your life by them. Recognize your differences and those of others in a kind and respectful way. Continuously observe the life of all things around you. Listen with clarity and a sound mind. Respect your own limitations and those of all of your surroundings. Allow yourself to learn and live by your wisdom. The turtle represents truth as he was during the creation of Earth and carries the teachings of life on his back. The turtle lives in life in a slow and meticulous manner because he understands the importance of both the journey and the destination. Truth is to know all of these things. Apply faith and trust in your teachings. Show honor and sincerity in all of what you say and what you do. Understand your place in this life and apply that understanding in the way you walk. Be true to yourself and all other things. Respect is represented by the buffalo. The buffalo gives every part of his being to sustain the human way of living, not because he is less value, but because he respects the balance and needs of others. To honor all creation is to have respect. Live honorably in teachings and in your actions toward all things. Do not waste and be mindful of the balance of all living things. Share and give away what you do not need. Treat others the way you would like to be treated. Do not be hurtful to yourself or others. Love is represented by the eagle because he has the strength to carry all the teachings. The eagle has the ability to fly highest and closest to the Creator and also has the sight to see all the ways of being from great distances. The eagle's teaching of love can be found in the core of all teachings. Therefore, an eagle feather is considered the highest honor and sacred gift. To know love is to know peace. View your inner self from the perspectives of all teachings. This is to know love and to love yourself truly. Then you will be at peace with yourself, the balance of life, all things, and also with the Creator. Diversity is the foundation of not only our ecosystems, but our societies. And if we can acknowledge this immediately and really start to build and create those respectful, reciprocal relationships with each other, as well as with Mother Earth now, in this time of extreme crisis, there is a ton of hope for our collective future. Jimigwach, a big thank you for the opportunity to tell my story. I hope that I have connected to you, inspired you, or at the very least, shared with you a little piece of information that you did not know before and your participation in this conference today. So again, miigwech.
Chimigwash, thank you so much, Kiri-Ann, for that beautiful presentation and for sharing your story, linking planning, conservation, and Indigenous relations while highlighting the imperative aspect of youth to be engaged throughout these processes. That was amazing. Thank you so much. And everyone, don't forget to check out the Cambium Indigenous Professional Services new website, which can be found in the chat box. So now we'll be introducing our 15-minute break. Please feel free to grab a coffee, a quick bite, and have some fun with our poll questions. Also, we hope you enjoy some of our classic and up-and-coming Black, Indigenous, and people of color artists in our playlist this morning. And after the break, we will be introducing our student spotlight sessions. We will be awarding the best presenter a year-long membership to the Conservation Authority of their choice. It's very exciting, so stay tuned and see you in 15 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Before I introduce our panelists, let's look at the results of our poll. Number one, hand on heart, are you wearing PJs right now? 38% said never, 26% 100% yes. I love that. 21% business on top, PJs on the bottom. I'm a part of that group. I don't remember the last time I wore real pants. And 14% said, I literally took them off a minute ago. That's amazing. So number two is tell us your affiliation. Here we're showing the breakdown of the range of affiliations of our participants. It's so great to see such a breadth of sectors. We have 14% from Conservation Authority, 5% from municipality, 5% from NGOs, 5% from provincial ministry, 2% from federal ministry, 52% students, 10% academia, and 7% interested party. That's awesome. And number three is with 1 being not optimistic to 7 being extremely optimistic. How optimistic are you that we will be able to fight climate change? And 31% said 5%, 5 out of 7 on staying hopeful in the fight against climate change. That's awesome. And we can only continue to stay hopeful and fight together. And number 4 is, what do you think is the most serious issue the world faces today? And 33%, the majority said social inequality. And I will definitely have to agree with that. And I'm really glad we have this platform to be able to discuss these interconnected issues between climate change, social inequality, poverty, food security, and all these critical facets of society that we need to address as a community. And lastly, our final question, asking what the D in Arthur D. Latornell stands for. The correct answer was Douglas, and 60% got it correct. That's wonderful. Okay, so thank you for participating, and now let's introduce our student spotlight sessions. It's a pleasure to have had these incredible graduate students join us today. Each and every one of them are doing important research in the fields of socio-environmental conservation, and it was a foundational aspect of the Latornell Student Symposium to create this platform to showcase the diverse work being done by researchers in this field. Each panelist has been individually chosen out of a pool of submissions based on the applicability and relevance of their research to both biological and cultural diversity. Our aim has been to support diversity in all forms in the selection of topics and speakers. With this being said, our goal during the student spotlight session has been to connect conservation research to careers. So please feel free to engage and connect with each panelist as their contact information will be provided in the chat box. We're also encouraging the attendees to ask questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A chat box. There will also be the opportunity to ask individualized questions during the 20-minute open question period. So each session will be 12 minutes, and then there will be a 5-question period afterwards. So without further ado, let's introduce you to our first panelist, Brady Reed. The title of Brady's session is Considering Climate Change, Regional Assessment and Large-Scale Mineral Development in Treaty Number 9 territory across the Hudson Bay Lowland Ecozone. Brady recently completed the Master of Arts in Environmental Policy program at Grenfell campus, working in collaboration with the community of Awipkek, Flat Bay. Currently, Brady is a first-year PhD in rural studies at the University of Guelph. His research interests intersect between environmental stewardship, community development, and the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge and decision-making processes. We're happy to have you, Brady. I'll hand it over to you.
Hello, I just want to make sure everyone can hear me and see me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I guess the reusing bios means that some things are not updated. So I'm in my second year of the PhD program. When I wrote that, I guess I was in my first year. And I think this should share. So I'm hoping everyone can see what I'm seeing. And before I begin, I want to just thank everyone for being here, and especially our keynote speakers, Don and Carrie Ann, and all the moderators that have worked to organize this excellent event. And especially Carrie Ann talking about being from Newfoundland as well. As a Newfoundlander myself, here in Newfoundland, I definitely welcome you to come visit, and you'll have a friend when you get here and to connect and show you around. But I want to begin just by recognizing that I'm here in Newfoundland on the east coast of Canada in Mi'kma'ki, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, and recognize the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province, Newfoundland and Labrador. It's interesting to me because I have a feeling, and as things have been happening so far, that we're going to hear a lot of land acknowledgements today with people spread across the country, and really learn about and hear about the histories and peoples of the land. And I think it's important to recognize that. And unfortunately, I think we've gotten to a point where land acknowledgement has become reading off a piece of paper or Googling what is the land acknowledgement for this place, which is an important first step, of course, to learn and gain that knowledge if you're unfamiliar. But it's, I think, about going beyond that reading of the reading off a piece of paper and thinking and sitting with that a bit as you work and as you go through your day, and in particular for this event where we have a space to talk about conservation and knowledges and worldviews across disciplines. It's important that we recognize as well that a lot of our work benefits directly on the land that we're on, and that, you know, there is a bleak side of conservation history, which includes the oppression of Indigenous peoples, and that continues and persists today with some tensions between Indigenous rights and Indigenous peoples and the beliefs and work that conservationists may engage in. So to really recognize that and bring that into your work and think about that throughout the session. So my talk today is considering climate change, regional assessment, and large-scale mineral development in Treaty Number 9 territory across the Hudson Bay lowland ecozone. As I said, I'm in Eastern Canada. My work is in Northern Ontario. So there's a bit of a divide there. So the first step that I took when I moved to Ontario, and I'm back in Newfoundland now because of the pandemic, but when I moved to Ontario was really to learn the context and to engage in conversation with people in the area and the region to learn about the histories. And that's where this presentation comes from today as I approach my PhD research. It's really about starting at a common ground. And so I could spend days talking about each individual facet of this presentation with all those different parts of the title. And so I'm going to try and give a broad overview in the next 12 minutes. But my name is Brady Reed, PhD student currently in rural studies at the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development at the University of Guelph. And you'll get to know me a bit more as we go through the presentation. Just want to make sure it'll switch. So a bit of the plan du jour, we'll start with an introduction of who I am. Then I'll set the stage a bit, looking at Treaty Number 9 specifically and the Hudson Bay Lowlands ecozone. We'll switch to look at some current developments, specifically in the Ring of Fire region. And I'm a big fan of maps and orienting people, so I'll have lots of those so you can understand where I'm talking about when I talk about it. Then we'll have a bit of a pandemic pause. I don't think it would be a presentation in 2020 if we didn't talk about the pandemic. So there'll be a bit on that. We'll look at specifically what is regional assessment, cumulative effects, and climate change. And then we'll look specifically at some of the preliminary work that I'm doing around theoretical frameworks and approaching research through the theory of new regionalism and considering current literature and some pathways forward. So before I get into some of the nitty-gritty, I want to talk about who I am. I'm a settler scholar with English and Mi'kmaq heritage, born and raised in Newfoundland. For those who may be unfamiliar with the territory of Mi'kmaq and Eastern Canada, I have a map there on the bottom that shows sort of the communities, the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet communities that exist throughout Mi'kmaq, which encompasses the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec, a bit of Maine, the New Brunswick, PEI, Nova Scotia, and the southwest coast of Newfoundland. And so that territory is very pervasive and is, you know, a lot of work going on throughout it. I was lucky enough to do my master's here at home on the west coast of Newfoundland, where I engaged with many Mi'kmaq elders and learned from them very significantly. And that's where this identity journey sort of took place. And I have a question there. Why does positionality and identity as a researcher matter for community-based research? Which is a big part of my research, is recognizing who I am as a settler scholar who grew up, you know, a white kid in Western Newfoundland, and then discovered through certain processes that I do have Mi'kmaq heritage and what that means and how to recognize that without, you know, respecting that without appropriating what that means as a scholar and being able to say that I'm an Indigenous scholar versus a settler scholar and the weight that comes behind that. And I'm happy to talk more about that later on. But I just wanted to give a bit more of an introduction to myself before we begin. So to set the stage, when I talk about Treaty 9 and the Hudson Bay Lowlands, Treaty Number 9 represents much of the far north of Ontario, covers 582,000 square kilometers with dozens of First Nation communities and reserves across that land. The treaty was signed in 1905 and 1906, and then again expanded in 1929 and 1930. So the treaty, from Ontario's perspective, was favored because of increased prospecting activity and promising mineral and forestry industry in the region, as well as the pursuit of the Canadian Pacific Railway. And so that those two reasons were one of the, you know, driving factors of this treaty. And then from the Indigenous perspective, from John Long, who wrote extensively about Treaty 9, he noted that they, as in community members in the far north, heard that the railroads were projected through their country and that already miners, prospectors, and surveyors were beginning to pass through it in such largely increased numbers that the game was disturbed. So what we see here is one perspective saying we want to sign this treaty because we have ideas of going to the north versus the other side of Indigenous communities who are already seeing people there and sort of feeling stuck that we have to go ahead and sign this and negotiate these treaties. So the treaty was also delivered to communities to sign. So that means it was written and finalized in Ottawa, and then was brought up to the north in several communities for representatives to sign. And there are now actually 2 recognized versions of the treaty, the oral version and the written version. And by that I mean they signed legal documents. The legal treaty says one thing, such as you are currently ceding your territory, we'll move you to reserves, among other things. But the oral version that was translated to people at the time in 1905 and again in 1929 told a different story. And so that has been held up in court recently. And again, I won't go too much into that as that's sort of just setting the stage. But switching gears to define the region as through the Hudson Bay Lowland Ecozone and the ecology, we're looking at the largest wetland in North America, covering 325,000 square kilometers that aligns very closely with Treaty 9 territory. And I'll show you a map very briefly. And this wetland stores 35 gigatons of carbon, which provides 10% of the global cooling benefit from peatland. So this is a globally significant area that is starting to get a bit more attention from conservation practitioners and policymakers, and is becoming more significant in these conversations about net zero emissions. Right now, it's relatively undisturbed by industrial development, but there are 15,000 active mining claims across the region at any given time. So there's proposed mining developments that threaten the HBL ecozone integrity, which again is exacerbated by climate change overall in the region. So when we talk about the far north of Ontario, this is the region I'm talking about. We're looking at the coast of the Hudson Bay and the James Bay, again with dozens of not all of the Indigenous communities are highlighted there. Those are just a few, but we have dozens of communities. The purple border represents Treaty 9, and you can see the Hudson Bay lowlands permeates that entire territory. And then right in the middle, the red and the yellow is what I talk about when I say the Ring of Fire. So this is a large mineral cache of chromite and other minerals that prospectors and mining companies have been starting to explore more as they've realized it may be potentially lucrative. And it's obviously in the far north of Ontario that is very remote. And so there's no roads that you can drive there. So that's where the problems are starting to arise. So the current developments that we're looking at right now are 3 proposed local scale impact assessments from the Impact Assessment Association of Canada. And those local scale impact assessments are looking at roads to connect the main highways in Ontario to the far north. And so we're talking about major expansion of the region and easier access for those in the south to get to the top, which have benefits and challenges. But we're looking at that. We're also looking at a proposed regional scale impact assessment, which I'll talk more about. And there's 6 active mining claims from Noront, who is one of the companies that has a lot of the land staked there, that are seeking early exploration permits in the region. And all of this, of course, during the pandemic. So this is happening right now as the global pandemic is going on. And so again, to reiterate the things that are happening, we have the current mining claims as the blue diamonds there, one of which is on the eastern side of the Attawapiskat River, and 5 are centered on the western side there in the Ring of Fire area. All of these, of course, at the headwaters of the Attawapiskat River, which directly flows to the community of Attawapiskat, who have, as you can see, the Victor Diamond Mine is also on the banks of the Attawapiskat River, which recently closed. And so Attawapiskat's been dealing with this sort of mining development for many years now. And you see the roads as well, stretching from southern Ontario and the Ireland area through to Martin Falls and up to Webequie, sort of bordering Ibamatung and Nishkantika. So those are currently underway and being discussed. And so this is again during a pandemic. So I wanted to highlight that this is a quote from Chief Munias with Nishkantika, who said, "We are ready to express our disappointment and dismay that remote Indigenous communities like ours that are currently dealing with acute social emergencies exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, such as the housing crisis and water crises, are still being asked to respond to mining exploration plans and permits so as to expedite these approvals." So when we talk about a pandemic pause, there are First Nation communities such as the one on the top, Coldwater Indian Band, who've said we don't consider a paper hearing to be sufficient to meet the Crown's duty to consult or a fair process given the interests that are at stake here. And so when I talk about engagement and the duty to consult, because of the pandemic, you can't meet in person. You can't consult and give feedback in person. So they're having to, if you see on the bottom there, the regional assessment in the Ring of Fire area, people are just submitting a comment online, which is, again, given the state that the lack of internet connectivity in the north and other factors, is very difficult for First Nations people to engage, and that's being brought up as an infringement on their rights, and asked to pause these things as they go forward. And looking at the time, I just want to kind of skip ahead here. So we talked about the regional assessment a little bit, because as a huge region that are defined by many, either Treaty 9 or looking at the lowland, Hudson Bay Lowlands ecozone. Here I have a map of all the different watersheds. So there's many ways to break up this region. So when we talk about defining a region, who gets a seat at the proverbial table? Whose voice is prioritized? If we're looking at this and we see, okay, Attawapiskat is in the Attawapiskat Coast watershed, they're downstream, are they going to be at the table? What about ones that are on the lakes and the headwaters of the Ring of Fire? And right now we're seeing a disjointed relationship between communities as we look at the regional assessment. And this is a breakdown essentially of some of the cumulative effects in the Hudson Bay Lowland ecozone. We're looking at ongoing proposed mineral development and exploration, other economic activities such as forestry or tourism, and the expansion of territory with proposed access roads. And of course, this is all in the gaze of climate change. So this is the most pervasive, and cumulative effects on the side there refers to changes to the environment caused by a variety of activities over time. And so this is a little infographic showing how to approach these discussions that comes from the IU Marine Group in Northern Quebec. And it starts with information, filters through both science and traditional knowledge on an equal level, which ends up in decision making. And so this is sort of a helpful tool to look at how to approach these conversations, which is through new regionalism. And so that is current theory that I'm looking at in my research as I approach research, which focuses on local grassroots cooperation, integration, and identity, and shifts the agency from top-down governmental state imposition to local level organizations. And this is great in principle, as I've said, but unfortunately exists in Western theoretical discourse. So the question I'm asking at this point, as I go through literature, is how can new regionalism be deconstructed and reimagined through an Indigenous lens that centers and validates Indigenous worldviews to approach decision-making around development and climate change adaptation mitigation in Ontario's far north, given all the context that I've given. And so I apologize for flying through that presentation, but I quickly recognize that 12 minutes is not a lot of time. So I definitely invite any questions or follow-up, as I know I just spewed a lot of information on you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brady. And so we'll be starting the 5-minute Q&A period. And I'll just remind you that if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box. And if you want to upvote a question that you see that's already there, you can press the thumbs up icon. So I'll give everyone a minute to get your questions in there. And if not, then I have a couple of questions for Brady as well.
Jessica, did you want me to, if there are questions in the chat, do I read them and answer them myself, or are you gonna share them?
I'm looking at the Q&A box, but are there questions appearing in the chat?
No, I just saw the chat, but it was not questions.
Okay, there's one in the Q&A box, so just give me a second. From Alex Beanstra, what is the likelihood that these mining proposals will go through?
It's a great question. I mean, I don't know the stats on how many of these things go through, especially given the weird context we're in. What I will say is the mining permits for early exploration, which include mechanized drilling with drills over 150 kilograms, and geophysical surveys, so actually walking the land. And so these early exploration permits are intruding on the territory. And I say intruding in a light sense, but they are bringing people into the territory. And the only sort of engagement they have with any of the Indigenous communities in the area is through a 30-day comment period, which for these specific proposals actually ended yesterday. And so when you think about the potential impacts of these activities and the cumulative effects, when we talk about cumulative effects, we're not just talking about the immediate impacts, we're talking about what happens down the road. So if you approve an early exploration permit and they explore and they find minerals, all of a sudden we're looking at a larger mine proposal and future interruptions to the land. So when you look at cumulative effects, it's not about what's happening now, it's what's happening down the road. And so 30 days to comment on that is very, very low. So unfortunately, the majority of comments that come in, there is no power to veto. It usually is just to mitigate. And so the likelihood is that all these proposals will go through, and the lucrative ones that discover profitable areas will proceed to the environmental assessment stage.
Okay, that's great, Brady. We have one more question, but I think we're going to maybe move on. Actually, we have two more questions. But Brady, are you able to answer them in the Q&A?
Yes, I should be able to respond to them by typing, right?
Okay, yeah, so you can type out the answers if that's okay with you. And thank you so much for your presentation. That was really great.
Thank you so much for having me.
And with that, we will be moving on to Angela, who will be introducing our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Brady, for that insightful presentation. I really enjoyed how you acknowledged the importance of power, positionality, and reflexivity as community-based researchers. That was awesome. And now I am pleased to present our second panelist, Sampoorna Bhattacharya. The title of Sampoorna's presentation is Participatory Research During the Pandemic, Agricultural Heritage Systems in Peru. Sampoorna is a second-year master's candidate in rural planning and development in the collaborative specialization of international development studies. She holds a BA in history and theory of architecture from Carleton University. Although born and familiarized in urban contexts, Sampoorna's brief work with local and national nonprofit organizations such as Heritage Ottawa and the National Trust for Canada, researching rural heritage conservation initiatives opened her eyes to the significance of rural lifestyles, values, and worldviews. Thank you, Sampoorna, and over to you.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me properly? Okay, I guess I can't get an answer for that, but okay, great, thank you. I'm just gonna share my screen here. Okay, I hope that's properly visible to everyone. Okay, hi everyone. I'm so happy and honestly really humbled to be here today among such dedicated students and professionals. Thank you so much to the Latornell Symposium organizational team for this wonderful event. My name is Sampoorna Bhattacharya. I'm joining in from what is today Guelph and has since about 11,000 years ago been the land of many indigenous peoples and cultures, namely the Atawandaron people and more recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. But I also want to share my respect for indigenous peoples from all over Turtle Island who now live here. And I pledge to stand with future generations to come as well. I must also express my gratitude towards the indigenous peoples of Peru, specifically the Quechua communities from whom I've learned so much already, and without whose guidance this research would be completely meaningless. My research at the moment is ongoing, so I won't be sharing results, but instead I'll be speaking about the evolving process. So as was mentioned, I'm in my second years. I'm a master's student in rural planning and development with a specialized collaboration in international development studies. And I also have a Bachelor of Arts in history and theory of architecture. In my previous studies, I recognized the gap in the content that was covered when teaching a curriculum of holistic history or heritage. It wasn't a problem with the school I attended or anything, but rather how world heritage is envisioned and perceived as a whole, as originating in ancient Egypt, moving on to ancient Greek, then Roman, and then very heavily Western Europe. And as someone who was born in Asia, this felt very strange to me. And I have since then tried to challenge Eurocentric notions and incorporate a diverse range of local narratives to truly result in a more holistic understanding of global heritage. I must also thank and acknowledge my, my advisors, Dr. Leith Deacon, who is well-versed in community resilience and diverse research methods, and Dr. Sylvia Sarapura, who is Peruvian and has introduced me to this world, and is also an experienced international rural strategic planner with a specialty in Latin American contexts. I must also say I'm not Peruvian. I think I mentioned that. I'm from India. So I'm just keeping that at the start of this presentation in case there's any confusion later on. So just starting off with understanding heritage, it's a very complex subject. The language around it can be confusing, which is never good. And that hinders diverse voices from participation. So a popular understanding of heritage is that it's both personal and political. While it's something that can hold significance to a community or an individual, it can also be used dangerously to spread propaganda or overshadow other existing heritage identities, and can be used as a tool for commodifying peoples, cultures, and landscapes. And this is often seen with over-tourism or unsustainable tourism measures. Keeping that in mind, the original definition of heritage is the way it's classified by UNESCO. So it can be either cultural, which means that humans have been involved, or natural, which means humans are not a part of it. Under cultural, there is built heritage, which is anything that can be touched or felt, or no, sorry, just touched. And intangible, which includes music, languages, the process of craft work, things that can't be touched basically. And when looking through a rural perspective, however, the lines between purely cultural and purely natural become very blurred, and it's difficult to separate the course of nature from the lifestyles of people. And for this reason, scholars have presented terms such as cultural landscape, biocultural heritage, and ecocultural landscape. With slight variations, they all pretty much mean the combined work of humans and nature. And there's an intersection between cultural heritage and environmental conservation here. And we have two components that I think are very important and probably well known by everyone who's attending today, and that's ecosystem services and traditional ecological knowledge, which contribute to our understanding of these terms. So the demographics of Peru, it's 20% rural population, and about 25 to 30 people, 30% of people in Peru are indigenous, and most of them are from Quechua communities. However, there's also a very distinct worldview that is followed in the high Andes, and it's called the Andean Cosmovision. And there are several values which govern the way in which people live and interact with each other. So maybe the most significant one of those is Aini, which means reciprocity. Ayu means community, but it represents kind of the communities of humans, plants, and animal realms. So it's believed that there can only be harmony when all three realms are healthy. Sumakase, or buen vivir, or living well, is a way of life which is ancient, but it's making a comeback now. And it's all about living with these values, taking only as much as is needed, and being part of a shared community and sharing resources. So I'm specifically looking at terraces, and I just want to give an overview of the terraces. It's not exactly sure when they originated in Peru, but the late anthropologist Dr. Ann Kendall's research shows that it was from a BC or BCE date. The Huari culture, which is from 600 CE, is also accredited to building some of the first functional terraces. And why are they important? Basically, they're like this organic way of, you know, like a very sustainable method. So of producing tubers and crops. So they have climate control. And by that, I mean, there's a 1 degree difference between every level of the terraces. So you can get like a whole range, like a 10-degree difference in a full terrace. and then it supplies water. So if you look at the Incan terraces, which are kind of a more adapted version of the original terraces, they have these channels and waterways which can bring water from higher levels to different levels and then distribute it to different communities. And then they help to absorb landslides, and they're also a place of ritual. So I'll just translate this. There's 9 threats to terraces around the world, which Timmy Tillman has, from the International Congress of Terraces, has come up with. And these are climate change. So basically with climate change, there's a change in predictability of how farming is done. Mining, which results in contamination and water flow issues, migration. So there's an aging population now because of jobs being offered in the cities and basically young people leaving rural areas. So there's a block in the transfer of knowledge on how to deal with the terraces. And then there's erosion of seeds, chemicals, industrialization, money on the market, so destroying local development. And then number 8 is colonialization of the mind. So this is not colonialization. What he's talking about here is actually policy that excludes local needs and positivist research, which is excluding indigenous development. And then the last one is actually talking about colonization. So these are my overall objectives. I want to determine local community members' perceptions about the terraces and understand how they interact with terraces. I want to compare the uses of terraces during past crises. So that was, colonization and food crises with current food crisis and COVID-19, and also examine the role of terraces in providing local communities with food security and opportunities for Indigenous governance, and explore the capacities of terraces in combating threats such as climate change, food crises, and marginalization. So when I started out with this research, I had really strong communications with partner organizations, which I'm really grateful for. And I also started this whole process by looking at what has already been done. So the International Potato Center was working on a new platform, and they launched it this summer, which is called the Andean Initiative. And that's a platform for partnership and problem solving between Andean communities in Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile. And it was a really nice indication that there are alternate understandings of geographies and boundaries that are being embraced. The Andes is a region that's not bound to a single country. The same way Quechua peoples do not map themselves as communities in only Peru, but throughout the Andean region. I also closely followed Association Andes' involvement with the International Network of Mountain Indigenous People, or INMIP, which essentially brings together people from several different countries to participate in horizontal knowledge exchange program, where the community leaders who know their communities best are given interpreters and translators, and they present information themselves, taking a ground up approach. And I was going to attend one this year, but COVID happened, so plans changed, lots of things changed. I don't think we need to go deeper into that. So after many discussions and fine tuning, due to the collaborations that I made earlier in the year and their great involvement in every step of the process, we together reached 3 methods, even though I'm not able to travel. The first is secondary data analysis. And in this method, I will be looking at maps, aerial maps of terraces, which show migration patterns to determine how people reacted in the times of crisis. And the second method is to conduct online interviews. And the third method is photo voice. So that sounds difficult to do online, but for this last method, I'm putting together a support team in the research sites, and they're very excited and enthusiastic about conducting this research and are looking forward to working with me. Thankfully, the research are being built on mutual trust and an equal level relationship. I consider them as the true knowledge keepers, and they have lived experiences to share in the subject, and I'm aware that my research wouldn't happen without them. So this collaboration is really important. And the support team is able to communicate with the participants better than I would have been able to because they speak Spanish or Quechua. So I guess overall, my main takeaways for conservation practice, of course, as I've been saying, is it's important to have non-hierarchical space for meaningful collaboration, encouraging local and traditional knowledge systems, and prioritizing local needs and wants. And of course, my main point is to include heritage within conservation practices. And why should we do this? So just wrap up in the last little bit of time I have. I'm not sure if I even have time, to be honest. But so ecotourism is a great way to do this. These are all studies from Peru. 2017 study done by the Conservation Strategy Fund found that investing in ecotourism made $720 million US in profit and created 36,000 new jobs. So great way to conserve the environment and also heritage strategies and do endogenous development. And then I put chefs in the top right because there has been an indigenous movement of including indigenous methods of cuisine into Peru's already very high acclaimed chef culture, cuisine culture. So to name a few, Gaston Acurio started this movement, but you can also catch Chef's Table on Netflix, and in which it talks about Virgilio Martinez, whose restaurant is actually shown in this photo on the right. And then at the bottom, I have Renata Flores on the left. She is climbing the charts, singing en Quechua, which is really powerful because Quechua was being wiped out by more people speaking Spanish. So she's really doing a really great job for the culture. And at the bottom right, I have geographic indicators. So basically that's a labeling system that tells you exactly where your food is coming from. So that keeps the rightful ownership of the products. And that is done. I have my website and my Instagram here because I'm trying to create another platform for, including diverse voices and rural voices as well. So thank you for listening. I hope I didn't go too over time.
Thank you, Sampoorna. That was really great. We have a few minutes for questions, so feel free to type them into the Q&A box. I see the first one asks, did you take all these photos yourself?
No, I did not. I was not able to travel, so I didn't do that, but I can share the presentation with you. It has notes of where the photos came from.
I have a question for you. You mentioned certain values and belief systems which are part of the Andean cosmovision. Are you able to elaborate on how these values are being prioritized in your own research?
Yeah, for sure. So, for example, INI, I mentioned, is reciprocity, and that's a huge one that's very important to my research. For example, just being aware of it, just reading about it has helped me understand how the rituals that take place involve these reciprocity elements to it. Secondly, the ethics process has included a lot of this value. So instead of like the documents that we create for ethics, I think what was more important is like verbal confirmation, and just being aware of local values has been a huge thing for the parties involved. And so there's also certain customs, like when I'm doing this research, if I was there personally, I would be bringing a little gift, such as coca leaves, which they chew a lot in the high Andes because it helps with health issues. So just being aware of that and putting that into my into the way I'm doing my research has been really important.
Okay, that's great. Apart from terrace landscapes, can you provide some other examples of cultural landscapes or biocultural heritage?
Yeah, for sure. So honestly, there's tons of cultural landscapes, but going by definition, like combined work of humans and nature, I feel like it's impossible to stop identifying these. But if you want specific, so very celebrated examples, I can point to two different organizations or initiatives. And one is the UNESCO Biosphere Reserves. I think Canada has 18, with 3 or 4 in Ontario. I know the Niagara Escarpment is definitely one of them. And then the second would be more rural focused. So that's the FAO's globally important agricultural heritage systems. Unfortunately not in Canada, but it's a really great resource to take a look at to understand rural cultural landscapes.
Okay, fantastic. If there's any more questions for Sampoorna, you can feel free to put them in the Q&A box and she can answer them in written form. And with that, we will close on that presentation and move on to the next one. So thank you again, Sampoorna. And Angela, I hand it over to you.
Perfect. That was excellent, Sampoorna. Thank you so much for sharing your research and knowledge on the intersectionalities within agricultural heritage systems at the nexus of climate change and social and environmental marginalization. So now we'll be presenting our third panelist, Ryan Matheson. The title of Ryan's session is Witnessing the Resurgence of Indigenous-Led Conservation, the IPCA. Ryan is a second-year graduate student at the Rural Planning and Development Department at the University of Guelph. He believes that conservation represents a mindset that must extend beyond park boundaries, and his research focuses on how Indigenous-led and mainstream conservation strategies influence each other. Ryan loves music, kayaking, and can be found in a coffee shop once the pandemic is over. Happy to have you, Ryan. I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Angela. I'm just going to share my screen here. And yeah, thank you for the Latornell organizers for organizing this. Thank you for the attendees for coming. And thank you for, of course, the keynote speakers. And a special thanks to whoever made the playlist for the event. That Tribe Called Red song that played at the break is a banger. So thank you for that. The research that I'm going to be sharing with you today on Indigenous-led conservation in Canada is kind of foundational work that I will be applying to further research that will be happening over the next couple months for a major research paper that I'm doing in fulfillment of the graduate program that I'm in, the Rural Planning and Development program at the University of Guelph. And yes, there's a little bit of background about what I'm going to be telling you. It's kind of the story of the relationship between conservation and Indigenous peoples and Indigenous conservation in Canada. I'd like to begin, like some of us have already done, by acknowledging that here in Guelph, I'm on the traditional territories of Attawandaron, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee peoples. It's also the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. It's also still home to many Métis, Inuit, and First Nations peoples. I am of settler heritage, and I live a very, very privileged lifestyle that was made possible in part by generations of hostility, racism, and inequity towards the original peoples of this land. And this is kind of the truth portion of it. And in the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to pledge to do my part in amplifying Indigenous voices, working towards Indigenous determined goals, and celebrating Indigenous contributions to our society. I encourage you to find out more about the place that you call home, the land that you call home, and the history of the peoples who have lived there since time immemorial. I say this at the start of the presentation, not just as a precursor or lip service, kind of as Brady was touching on, but as acknowledgement that this is part of the process. We're going to get into the fact that Indigenous-led conservation is hand in hand with processes of decolonization in a little bit, and land acknowledgement is an active step that can be taken towards decolonization, and not just something that happens at the beginning of business, but something to remind us that all business being done on this land is in this context of Indigenous lands. So here's a little bit about what we're going to be going over: Indigenous peoples in Canada and history with Canadian conservation. A very, very brief history. It's hard to get all of that into a couple minutes, but I'll do my best. And then what this actually means for us conservationists, whether you're a professional, a student, or a researcher. So again, I'm going to provide a very, very brief history, a bite-sized version of the entire history of Canadian conservation and how it relates to Indigenous peoples. I've split it up into 3 sections, 3 eras that I call removal, recovery, and resurgence. And it's important to know that I've split it up like this kind of for ease of presentation, but in reality, these eras do overlap a lot. And perhaps most importantly, the earlier eras are still informing and still influencing what's happening in the more modern eras. So the first era of removal is characterized by Canadian government enacting command and control style governance systems near Confederation, near the founding of Canada. This resulted in exclusion and eviction of Indigenous peoples, dispossession of lands, and displacement of communities. And the underlying philosophy here was that the Canadian government, in setting up a park system, was trying to namely enhance economic outlook for settler communities by drawing boxes around large swaths of pristine Canadian wilderness in order to protect, either for, like I said, economic reasons, or for conservation reasons like preserving wildlife or iconic landscapes. Of course, the fallacy here is that Canada was not founded on pristine wilderness. It was in fact founded on the traditional lands of hundreds of distinct Indigenous nations with their own cultures, languages, and ways of life. A few key examples of parks that have very explicit histories of exclusion and eviction of Indigenous peoples are Riding Mountain National Park in Manitoba, Banff National Park, Algonquin Provincial Park, and Stanley Park in Vancouver. And this is just a very short list of well-known protected areas with these kind of dark histories. But if you add to this list any protected area that is on treaty ceded land that was taken forcefully, that restricts Indigenous use, or which is actively working to extend settler power over land, you begin to see that the list of protected areas that have benefited from the dispossession of Indigenous lands and displacement of Indigenous people is very long, if not inclusive of every single protected area in Canada. The next era I've classified as recovery, which alludes to a point in time a few decades ago where due to Indigenous-led activism, Indigenous rights were starting to be re-recognized and regained after being denied by colonial practices for so long. So like I said, because of Indigenous-led activism, some important constitutional and legal changes occurred around the 1970s and 1980s. The one that I have listed there, Section 35 of the Constitution Act, which entrenched Indigenous rights and Aboriginal title in the Canadian Constitution. There's also the famous court case of R versus Sparrow, which affirmed Indigenous rights to hunt and fish on traditional territories. During this era of recovery, we begin to see the rise of co-governance agreements or co-management of not just protected spaces, but natural resources in general, as kind of a key characteristic of this era. And while there are some examples of how co-management was implemented in a successful way, one of the most famous ones is Guayahanas National Park Reserve on the West Coast. Most co-management arrangements fall to some pretty major criticisms. The first one is that although co-management boards, co-management arrangements led to increased indigenous engagement. They didn't actually lead to increased indigenous influence over conservation policies or practices. It also allowed the government to give the appearance of decentralization to these co-management boards, when in reality, the co-management boards only acted in an advisory role, and the true decision-making power was still held by government agencies such as Parks Canada. And finally, co-management has been criticized for allowing the assimilation of indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge into Western machinery of science and governance, effectively separating the knowledge from its cultural foundations, which is obviously not in the spirit of reconciliation or conservation. We appear currently to be in the era of resurgent indigenous-led conservation, and again, there are still many aspects of the removal and the recovery era that manifest in ways today, but this resurgence of indigenous-led conservation, resurgent obviously is referring to the fact that before the era of recovery, there was a much longer era of a time when indigenous peoples had full tenure and full decision-making power over the lands that are now Canada. So the resurgent indigenous-led conservation movement was again made possible by decades of indigenous-led activism that led to the adoption of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, and more specific to the Canadian context, the Indigenous Circle of Experts We Rise Together report. In this report, the Indigenous Circle of Experts offers the IPCA, the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area, as a modern iteration of traditional Indigenous conservation practices. And they define it as, on the screen there, lands and waters where Indigenous governments have the primary role in protecting and conserving ecosystems through Indigenous laws, governance, and knowledge systems. I believe there's already 27 IPCAs that have been slated for funding through a federal government initiative, the Canada Nature Fund, which is an exciting new development in this world of IPCAs. There's a few key reasons why us as conservationists should be supporting the resurgent Indigenous-led conservation that are outlined in this article that I have cited here at the bottom, Artel et al., which came out just last year. There's a few key reasons why conservationists should be supporting this. The first is that Indigenous protected and conserved areas offers a way to rapidly increase the amount of protected areas in Canada. It also provides evidence that Indigenous-led conservation enhances the effectiveness of conservation from a lens of socio-ecological effectiveness. So not just biodiversity, but also health of communities that are associated with those protected areas. And finally, perhaps most importantly, going forward, the creation of new protected areas will probably not be possible, justified, or legal without the involvement of Indigenous peoples who are associated with that land being protected. And it is a justice imperative, as the authors put it, to not only involve Indigenous peoples, but to ensure that they are in leadership positions and making management decisions about those areas. That's not just for new protected areas, that applies for existing protected areas that are currently undergoing a shift towards involving local Indigenous actors as well. So what does this all mean for conservationists? What it boils down to is the fact that conservation will need to be decolonized for Indigenous-led resurgence to fully be realized. And this quote at the end I really liked here in a paper by Tuck and Yang called "Decolonization is not a metaphor," and it's decolonization is not an and, it is an elsewhere. Which refers to the fact that systemic change is going to be necessary for decolonization to be realized, and that there are a lot of Western institutions that are currently incommensurable with the idea of decolonization, and conservation in many ways is one of those institutions. So as professionals, researchers, and students in this area, there are a few things that we can we can do to be good allies and to work towards effective decolonization of conservation. The first is an idea that is presented by the Indigenous Circle of Experts in the We Rise Together report, and that is to adopt an ethical space approach, and that's for all professionals, researchers, and students. Ethical space is understanding that virtually all conservation policy and the data that informs it is filtered through a colonial lens. Ethical space means that collaboration is not about procedural or consultation requirements. It's about creating relationships between people. And although these relationships are maybe mandated or required by things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, UNDRIP, treaties, other physical documents, those are really just frameworks which this space exists in, and not, like I said, not because it's required. For more professionals specifically, it's important to advocate for and support Indigenous engagement and leadership within conservation. This might mean making space for Indigenous voices. It might mean if you're in a position of power to hire more Indigenous people into your organization. It might mean following the directions and the wishes of Indigenous professionals and Indigenous leaders. For professionals and researchers, to address the practical challenges specifically that come with implementing IPCAs. Like I said, they're a relatively new idea in Canada, and there's going to be some interesting research and work to be done around how IPCAs fit in with current land use plans, current municipal bylaws, and kind of going along with that, as if an IPCA involves a change of land tenure, how are conflicts managed between non-Indigenous stakeholders and the Indigenous groups setting up IPCAs. There's also interesting work to be done looking at the coexistence of governance system and legal pluralism, wherein either two governance systems exist side by side or two legal systems exist side by side, which is what would need to happen for IPCAs to be successful. For all of us, again, to relay the true history of Canadian conservation and land use planning. And like I said, I gave you a very bite-sized version of what the history of conservation is in Canada. And it's I would encourage you to learn more about the history and to relay that truth. Reconciliation and decolonization is a continuous process. It requires constant self-reflection, learning, openness, and perhaps most especially a willingness to have uncomfortable conversations about the past, the present, and the future of, in this case, conservation. Thank you. It's been an honor to share my thoughts with you, and thanks for listening. Here's a little reading list if you want to look at this afterwards.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That was really great and very closely tied to my own research. So I can really appreciate your presentation. We'll give a minute for the Q&A box. We have a couple minutes left for questions. And if not, I have a couple questions to ask you myself. And if we run out of time for questions, then you can post them to the Q&A box and Ryan will answer them at a later time. One question from Samantha Cava. Out of the 27 areas being funded to become designated IPCAs, how many are located in Ontario? Also, are these 27 areas currently existing as Western conservation areas, or are they undesignated areas?
That's a good question. I'm not sure an exact number of the 27 that are in Ontario, but there are a number that's readily available online. I was just trying to Google it quickly while you were asking the question there. But yeah, Jessica, if you said this is in your area, if you know that exact answer, that'd be good. As far as I know, there are some that are on areas that are already protected in some way, but not necessarily all of them. No.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the exact number either. A lot of my research is focused out east, but I know there are some under development, some IPCAs in Ontario right now.
Yeah.
One more question from Mark Zanoni. I was wondering about the change of government from Harper to Trudeau and whether it has impacted conservation policies.
In this instance, yes, the We Rise Together report was the Indigenous Circle of Experts was commissioned by the Trudeau government, and we didn't really see much of that outreach under the Harper government, as far as I know.
Okay, that's great. If more questions come up, please type them in the Q&A box, and Ryan will be happy to answer them at a later time. And with that, I will be handing it over to Angela again to introduce our next speaker. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It's really great to learn more about decolonizing research and how we can continue to practice that in our own work. So now we'll be presenting our fourth panelist, Jennifer Gleason. The title of Jennifer's session is High Throughput DNA Sequencing Reveals Patterns in Aquatic Invertebrate Biodiversity in an Agricultural Landscape. Jennifer obtained a Master's of Science studying wetland ecology from the University of Waterloo and is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Guelph. Her major research interests include community ecology, invertebrate biodiversity, and freshwater conservation. And her work has focused on how aquatic macroinvertebrate communities are influenced by agricultural activity in the watershed. Currently, Jennifer conducts her fieldwork in Southern Ontario streams and is exploring the use of high throughput sequencing or DNA metabarcoding to characterize aquatic biodiversity for biomonitoring purposes. Over to you, Jennifer.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. All right. Like Angela said, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Guelph, and I am really excited to be presenting my research here today, which is focused on broadly biodiversity patterns in Southern Ontario. These results in particular are something I'm extra excited about because this research was actually put on hold back in March during the initial COVID lockdowns. So for about 4 months, I was kicked out of the lab. And so this is work I've actually been doing in the past 2 or 3 months and just recently got the results back. So I'm very excited to share them with you today. My research incorporates both ecological fieldwork and molecular lab work, and I've always been particularly passionate about Canadian biodiversity, particularly insect biodiversity. You can also find me doing outreach events such as Guelph Bug Day. And I've really enjoyed my time at the University of Guelph, in part because my research is funded by this broad overarching grant called Food from Thought. And broadly, its major goals are to explore the impact of biodiversity or agriculture on biodiversity and the resilience of both terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, as well as improve sustainability in the systems we all depend on for food while maintaining important ecosystem services and habitat space for biodiversity. Now, I study aquatic macroinvertebrates, which include insects, as well as mollusks like snails and clams, and leeches and aquatic worms. Now, these are a very exciting group to me because they're extremely biodiverse. They also have historically been used as bioindicator taxa in aquatic assessments. So a lot of aquatic insects have well-established sensitivities to changes in water quality and habitat condition, and their presence or absence in a system can tell us something about the state of that habitat. They're also a very important aquatic and terrestrial link because a lot of these aquatic insects, like this caddisfly, dragonfly, and midge pictured here, have aquatic larval stage followed by a winged terrestrial adult stage. So they really tie in together the importance of the riparian zone, so the beside stream vegetation, and the aquatic habitat. They're closely linked. They're also appealing to study because they're quite easy to collect in the field and don't require any specialized equipment. A caveat, of course, is that they're extremely challenging and time-consuming to identify. So many of these groups can't be reliably identified to species level because the juvenile stages don't have enough characteristics, and they also require a high degree of specialization to identify. However, over the past decade, there have been major advancements in molecular identification tools, which have the potential to be incorporated into biomonitoring programs, which is what my research focuses on. So I'm using molecular identification, or DNA barcoding, to identify macroinvertebrate communities. Now, the basis behind DNA barcoding is like in a grocery store, you have a barcode that's associated with a series of numbers. And when you scan that, that links back to a product table and brings up the particular product you are purchasing. The same idea is behind DNA barcoding, except instead of numbers, all species have a DNA barcode made up of 4 nucleotide bases. And so we can extract and amplify DNA and sequence it. And based on the order of these bases, we can assign them a DNA barcode, which can then be matched to a taxonomic reference library in order to assign taxonomic information to our unknown species. Now, it's extremely important to be able to get this kind of species level resolution, because before we can kind of assess habitats, we need to really know what is living there. Now, agriculture can influence streams in a number of ways, including reducing the stream side or riparian vegetation, which decreases shading of the stream and results in algal blooms, as well as changes the whole nutrient pathway so you're getting reduced infall of leaves and other organic material, reducing habitat space, and ultimately reducing habitat complexity. So channelization of streams reduces available microhabitats, which can homogenize stream communities. Now, it's important to note that my work is in Southern Ontario, which is a heavily developed landscape. So looking at this overview map, we can see kind of a sea of yellow agriculture, primarily corn and soybean and squash crops, which of course is of huge economic importance to Canada, and it's important to be able to feed ourselves and our growing population. However, we need to kind of assess the influence agriculture has on these natural environments in order to maintain the ecosystem services they provide to us, especially in the wake of changing climate. Now, if you look at kind of the green dots across Southern Ontario, these are our tiny islands of conservation areas surrounded by a sea of yellow. So while a lot of us working in this kind of bioassessment space tend to think of a kind of binary between degraded and pristine habitats, I'd like to reiterate that there's no such thing as a pristine habitat here in this area. Even upstream of conservation area site, we do have farms, and of course, we're getting the same runoff into the stream from that landscape, which then filters down throughout the stream network and eventually into the Great Lakes. I have 3 main research questions I'm going to be covering today. The first of which is simply a methodological question surrounding repeatability in my results. So are my sequencing results consistent between samples? What I mean by this is if I sequence the same invertebrate sample twice, am I getting the same community composition? Now, this is very important to be able to infer kind of ecological conclusions from this data set. Second, I'm exploring taxonomic resolution, so family or species level ID, and how that can reveal patterns in community composition to agriculture. So whether we can see a difference in conservation area and farm communities. For example, chironomids or non-biting midge larvae, pictured here, are a very diverse group that are very challenging to ID. It involves dissecting their mouth parts and slide mounting their head capsules. And so while this group is often lumped as one family in ecological assessments, it's actually many different species that all have different kind of traits, functional traits, and habitat preferences. Finally, I'll be discussing beta diversity. Now, beta diversity is essentially a measurement of how different 2 communities are from each other. So these 2 mock communities I have here at the bottom of the screen each have the same species richness of 3, so 3 species in each community. However, there's absolutely zero overlap in community composition. So it's a very high beta diversity, very high dissimilarity value. What I want to know is whether or not invertebrate communities in higher agricultural regions are more homogeneous, so have lower beta diversity. This would mean that simplified farm streams are supporting less complex communities. Now, I collected all of these macroinvertebrates samples from either conservation areas or farms in Southern Ontario last summer in July of 2019. I based my field protocols off of the Ontario benthic biomonitoring network protocols. I'm going to briefly overview my lab work pipeline. So essentially, I had 80 composite invertebrate samples that were sorted into these special tubes, dried, and then these tubes were attached to my tiny bug blender that ground up the insect sample into a fine powder, fine mixed powder. I was then able to extract DNA from this bug powder, followed by PCR amplification, which amplifies the gene region I'm interested in. And then I submitted these samples for sequencing, which resulted in over 20 million sequence reads, which is hugely exciting. It's a large amount of data I have to work with and more on the way. I then ran a bioinformatics pipeline, which involves some quality control steps, but most importantly, it clusters sequences based on similarity into operational taxonomic units, which I use as a proxy for species. These were then matched to a sequence reference library called the Barcode of Life database, or BOLD. First off, the gray bars here, or each bar represents a paired technical replicate, so one sample sequenced twice, and the gray bars represent how many taxa these technical replicates had in common, and the colored portions represent unique taxa to each replicate. So as you can see, the gray bars are very large, which indicates a really high consistency between technical replicates, which means I'm getting reliable community characterization. For overall taxonomic richness, I had over 120 macroinvertebrate families, but there was no significant difference in family level richness between farms and conservation areas. However, I had over 800 OTUs or species, but surprisingly, the OTU richness was higher in farm sites. So farm sites were more diverse than conservation area sites. However, when I dig a little deeper into this data, I find that over 35% of these OTUs were chironomids alone, so all one family. Like I said, this is a really diverse group, and they've also historically in bioassessments been known to be quite tolerant of changes in water quality, so it's likely that they're very well represented in these farm sites. Digging a little deeper into this data, I performed some redundancy analyses and Permanova with site type, so conservation area or farm as a constraint. And at the family level, I see no significant difference in community composition between farms and conservation areas. However, at the species level, we see a significant difference in community composition. So DNA barcoding is revealing patterns of invertebrate communities in response to agriculture that we're simply not seeing at higher taxonomic resolution. Finally, I observed that beta diversity decreased with increased agricultural land cover. So this means that increased habitat complexity yielded higher beta diversity. However, this pattern was not detectable at family level resolution. I would like to point out that, however, beta diversity was quite high at all of these sites, either farm or conservation area, indicating there's probably a large influence of rare species in this data set, which I'm excited to dig into further. In summary, DNA barcoding was able to reliably characterize aquatic invertebrate biodiversity. However, family level identification actually masks these changes in response to community composition in response to agricultural influence. This increased agricultural pressure in the landscape resulted in more homogeneous invertebrate communities overall. Now, using high throughput sequencing, I was able to provide a higher estimate of macroinvertebrate biodiversity compared to family level morphological identification. This increased resolution allowed me to better detect how Local and landscape scale processes interact to influence stream communities. And I believe that incorporating molecular identification methods into freshwater assessments can improve our understanding of how benthic communities respond to changing habitats. Finally, I'd just like to thank everyone who's been involved in this project, from helping me in the field to invertebrate sorting and providing advice and feedback on my molecular and bioinformatics pipelines, as well as thank all the farmers and conservation authorities who allowed me to work on their property. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was really great. We have a couple questions in the chat already for you. So from Francis, where were you when Hallman and all dropped in 2017 dropped? I hope you know what that reference means.
No, I don't. If the speaker would give a quick summary, or I can open up my Mendeley library.
We'll wait a minute for a response from Francis. In the meantime, can you expand more on the role DNA barcoding has had with identifying and enhancing biodiversity in heavily developed regions such as Southern Ontario?
So molecular identification, it's really kind of exploded over the past 10 years, but we're just starting to get into kind of the application phase of it. So currently it's not incorporated into any official biomonitoring programs because in the first stage of DNA barcoding, it was really just testing out methods and also building a reference library. So we have taxonomic experts who assign IDs to an organism, and then it's sequenced, and that gets built up in the BOLD library. Application-wise, it's been very successful actually in the food fraud industry, particularly in fish, seafood, and determining fish being sold as a different species, often being marketed as a more expensive species, but in reality, it's actually a cheaper species. But now that sequencing costs have begun to drop, and now we have high throughput sequencing, which means I can sequence an entire community at once rather than one by one. It's really powerful in terms of what we can use to apply it for large scale projects like this.
Oh, apparently Francis clarified in the chat. So let's see.
Yes.
Decline over 27 years in total.
Yes.
In protected areas. That
was pretty devastating, not just to entomologists like myself, but I think to anyone who cares about conservation, and especially in the wake of climate change and the Ontario government kind of most recently slashing protections to conservation areas and the Endangered Species Act in Ontario. It's extremely disheartening to see, and I hope that my research can provide some insight onto kind of how our actions are influencing not just insects, but the food webs and communities they're part of as a whole.
Okay, that's great. There's one more question in the chat, but I think if you could just answer it privately or on the chat, because we're going to move on. A reminder that if you're posting questions in the Q&A, can you please just put the name of the person that the panelist that you're addressing, just so we know who it's being addressed to. And with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you, Jennifer. And Angela, it's back to you to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was a really great presentation. So now we'll be presenting our fourth panelist, Courtney Robichaud. The title of Courtney's session is Multi-Trophic Responses to Invasive Phragmites australis Suppression. Courtney is a PhD student in the biology department at the University of Waterloo. She's a community ecologist whose main research focus is how disturbances and stressors affect aquatic ecosystems and works with a variety of taxa from plants to birds. It's a pleasure to have you, Courtney. Over to you.
Hi, thanks so much. And thank you so much for inviting me here today. So, I'm going to be sharing with you all some of the work that I've been doing for the last 4 years as a major part of my PhD research. Some of it's still in progress, but we're kind of getting towards the end. I'll be defending soon, so I'm excited to share with you what I've found over the past 4 years. And before I get started, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge everyone who's made this work possible. It's a really large collaborative project that I've been fortunate to be a part of. And I also want to take a moment to just acknowledge the land that I've had the opportunity to work on. So Long Point, where the majority of my work takes place, is the land of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations. And Waterloo and the University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Tract, land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations. And I'd like, if you have a moment after this presentation, if you could look into 1492 Land Back Lane and support these Haudenosaunee land defenders who are trying to protect a portion of the Haldimand Tract from a housing development. They have a legal fund that you can support, and anything, even just $5 would be great if you could help out in that situation. So to set the stage for my work, we're losing wetlands at a rapid pace globally, and that's also happening here in our backyard. So we have lost over 80% of the wetlands in some regions of Southern Ontario. And this is a huge problem because of all of the important ecological services that wetlands provide, but also because wetlands are biodiversity hotspots. So these wetlands are the sort of interface between aquatic and terrestrial systems. There's a lot of species that are specialized specifically for wetlands and generalist species that use them as well because of just the high amount of diversity and biomass produced by all of them. So my work takes place in these two marsh complexes located on the north shore of Lake Erie, Long Point Peninsula and Rondeau Provincial Park. So together, these two marsh complexes represent more than 70% of the remaining intact wetlands on that north shore of Lake Erie. And this, given the context of wetland loss on the landscape, really highlights how important they are for wetland species in the region and other species. They're very important for biodiversity. In fact, Long Point is a World Biosphere Reserve, and both Rondeau and Long Point Peninsula are recognized as important bird areas because they're so important for bird communities, both nationally and globally. And marshes have a kind of unique characteristic where the vegetation community is very diverse in response to hydrology. So you have this distinct vegetation zonation from shallow open water wetlands up to a more terrestrial meadow marsh interface, and that's going from deep standing water up to shallow standing water. And this vegetation diversity gives rise to a huge amount of habitat diversity, which allows all of these species to kind of coexist in one place. And this means that an invasive species such as Phragmites australis, subspecies australis, which is a perennial grass, can be incredibly detrimental. So Phragmites was first introduced to Canada in the early 1900s from Europe, and it began to spread in these coastal marshes in the late 1990s, likely due to the introduced lineage being introduced specifically to those places then, and the low water levels of Lake Erie, which exposed substrate and allowed it to colonize. So Phrag produces extensive above and below ground biomass. If you've ever been lucky enough to stand right next to Phrag or even in a stand of Phrag, you'll realize it's incredibly tall and very dense. It easily reaches 2.5 meters in height, and we've measured over 100 stems per meter squared when we go out there and measure living and dead stems. So it's really dense, it's very challenging to get through, and as much biomass as you see above ground, there's essentially the same equivalent below ground. And Phrag grows across that entire water depth gradient that I mentioned earlier. So from sort of a meter of standing water all the way up to dry soil. And this allows it to outcompete and displace resident vegetation species, homogenizing the vegetation in these wetlands and therefore reducing habitat diversity. Now, anything that reduces diversity and heterogeneity in a wetland will likely have negative consequences for the wetland species that rely on it. And Long Point and Rondeau are two wetlands that we've deemed incredibly ecologically important that we want to protect. So what do we do when there's an invasive species that is altering the landscape? Well, the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and the Nature Conservancy of Canada, along with a bunch of other partners, decided to employ a large-scale project to suppress Phragmites australis growth in these marshes. And this was the first time in Canada that a glyphosate-based herbicide has been used directly over standing water to control an invasive species. So this, in 2016, they started this project using a helicopter, and they targeted very dense stands of Phragmites. Now, I just want to take an aside and say that they had to get a lot of permits for this. It's a custom glyphosate-based herbicide. You can't buy this over the counter. You can't go up to your local store, buy this and treat frag that's standing in wet substrate at home. You have to, this is a special procedure that they went through. But of course, spraying a herbicide over a biosphere reserve to control and establish invasive species raises a lot of questions and a lot of concerns. So this is where my PhD research comes in. Essentially, I'm doing a lot of ecological monitoring to see how wetland species respond to the suppression of an established invasive species. So Phragmites has been in this area for 30 years. How do species respond once we remove it? And I'm going to be sharing a kind of an overview of 3 components of my work with you today. The first is looking at how effective this suppression was, so measuring the regrowth of Phragmites after treatment. The second is looking at the recovery of native vegetation. So once you remove frag, what comes back? And the third is looking at an assessment of essentially aerial insectivore birds, the prey that's available to them, and where they prefer to forage by comparing different habitat types within the marsh. So I'm going to bring you right through the efficacy and recovery first component of my project. So to do this, our lab set up a traditional before-after control impact monitoring design. And we set up 80 sites split evenly between Long Point and Rondo Provincial Park. Now, in each of these parks, we had, again, the sites were split evenly between a control treatment or control sites where no herbicide was applied, and treatment sites where the herbicide was applied. Now, all of these sites were paired along the water depth gradient that frag was naturally occurring, and all of them had similar high densities of frag, which means they all would have been treatment candidates. However, some of them just simply weren't treated. And this allowed us to, in 2016, we went in and sampled all of these sites. We measured the total living and dead stems, the community composition, and a few other variables. But we measured this in 2016 before any treatment occurred. And then again in 2017 and 2018, which I'll be sharing with you today. And my lab has continued on, done this in 2019, 2020, and we'll continue to do it next year. So we have sort of a longer term data set. Additionally, we also measured some reference uninvaded habitat to give us kind of a recovery target for these sites. So first things first, we can say the herbicide treatment was incredibly effective at reducing the growth of live Phragmites stems. So 1 year after treatment, there was a 99% reduction in live frag density compared to the control sites. And I put a photo here to kind of illustrate what that looks like for you. So you can see there's a little bit of standing dead remaining in the year afterwards, but there's no living frag. 2 years after treatment, we found a 95% reduction compared to the control sites. So this illustrates, and you can see it in the figure, where there's a little bit of regrowth at a few sites. And this really highlights the importance of specific follow-up after you do these big projects. So if you're budgeting or if you're planning a project like this, follow-up is a very important component to go in and do sort of targeted control to make sure you don't reach those really high population levels again in a few years. So this is really positive in terms of suppressing the regrowth of Phragmites, but you're probably wondering, okay, you moved frag has been there for 30 years. What's coming back? What's in the seed bank? What can reach these sites? And the great news is that about 40% of these sites, 2 years after treatment, begin to really kind of look like the reference vegetation. Lake Erie water levels have been very high for the past few years, and that's influenced what's come back. But we can see a lot of floating and submersed aquatic vegetation, as well as emergent vegetation, which is really positive. You can see in the top kind of right corner here, there's a lot of wild rice coming back in some of the Rondo sites. And this is really wonderful to see. All of these photos that I'm showing you were just a complete dense monoculture of Phragmites 2 years before. However, at the remaining sites, they're sort of representing a more novel community. that is characterized by a really high abundance of European frogbit. Now, this is another invasive species introduced into Canada, I think in the 1930s, and it's the small floating plant in the photo here. It kind of looks like a lily pad. And you'll see in the sites where Phragmites was treated that frogbit is incredibly abundant, and it creates these kind of floating mats. However, frogbit always or often was co-occurring with Phragmites before this treatment happened. So you'll see in this photo on the left, you can see that really dense canopy of Phragmites, and you see a really dense sort of lower canopy of frogbit. So when we control Phragmites, we allow frogbit to proliferate because we've kind of removed competition for both space and light. Now, the consequences of frogbit in a marsh ecosystem are not super well understood. However, some of the research that I have read has found that it might not be as detrimental as we expect in terms of affecting aquatic food webs. However, this is definitely an area that warrants further research. And so bringing us kind of into the next portion of my work, we've seen these dramatic changes from a monoculture of Phragmites to sort of shallow open water wetland habitats. And how do other biotic communities respond to this? So this brings us into my assessment of aerial insectivores, where the prey that's available to them and where they're foraging. This is primarily focused on swallows. And swallows are, or aerial insectivores, are a guild in Canada and North America that have been experiencing incredibly steep declines in their population over the past few decades. So it's really important that we understand how they respond to the way we're treating these marshes that they use for foraging habitat. Additionally, I've been working in these marshes since around 2014, looking at wetland bird communities. And I noted in this paper that was published in 2017 that aerial insectivore birds or aerial foragers were using invaded Phragmites habitat less often than other habitat types. And this kind of piqued our interest because we were like, why is that? There's not necessarily an obvious answer. They shouldn't have a difficult time flying over that habitat, for example. But one possible suggestion or explanation would be there's the food quality isn't as good for them in invaded Phragmites. So to kind of answer this question, while at the same time this large-scale herbicide treatment was going on, I designed and deployed this project where I'm comparing the emerging invertebrates in invaded Phragmites australis habitat, in remnant uninvaded habitat, and in sites that were treated with herbicide in 2016. And this involved deploying these emergence traps for a continuous measure of emerging invertebrates over the field season. And every 10 days, we went out and collected these bottles. And at that time, we did a point count survey where we looked at only the aerial foragers in sort of a very tight circumference of point counts. And we evaluated their foraging activity, their abundance, and species richness. So we have a nice measure then of continuous biomass production among these habitats paired with a sort of point in time measure of how many aerial insectivores are foraging over these sites. And what I'm sharing with you today is sort of preliminary work, and these are just kind of broad trends. But this right here is emerging invertebrate. Panel A is abundance, panel B is richness, just to the family level. But one thing that stands out that just kind of smacks you in the face is there's an incredibly high number of emerging invertebrates in this herbicide-treated habitat, which I should clarify, we sampled in 2017 and 2018, so 1 and 2 years after the treatment occurred. Herbicide-treated sites in particular had an incredibly high amount of chironomids, which Jenny did a great job of introducing them to you for me. So these are the adult non-biting midges or mayflies. We had about 37,000 individuals in all of the samples, and about 30,000 individuals came from the herbicide-treated habitat alone. You'll also note that uninvaded habitat has slightly higher abundance of emerging invertebrates, especially at certain sites. But you'll notice in panel B that the richness, at least to the family level, is not super different amongst these 3 habitat types. It's maybe a little bit lower in herbicide-treated sites, but fairly comparable between invaded and uninvaded habitat. So interesting, there's more emerging invertebrates after we've treated and suppressed Phragmites, but how are the aerial insectivores using these habitats? So again, in 2017 and 2018, we did find more evidence that the abundance of aerial insectivores, so that's panel A and B here, is lower in invaded habitat relative to the herbicide-treated habitat and the uninvaded habitat. So we sort of found support for this strange trend that we noticed in 2015 in our 2017 paper. However, you'll notice that there's really minimal differences in species richness. So the same number of species were foraging over all three habitat types. However, this starts to allow us to kind of pull on the threads and maybe find some trends, which is that perhaps aerial insectivore birds, swallows in particular, are foraging less often over invaded Phragmites australis habitat because there are lower total emerging invertebrates available for them. So to bring it all back together, just to summarize, herbicide was extremely effective at suppressing Phragmites in these marshes. Native vegetation did start to recover 2 years after treatment, but it does respond to the prevailing water levels. So if you have incredibly high water levels in Lake Erie, you will see shallow open water emergent vegetation come back, as opposed to meadow marsh vegetation, which may rely on drawdown and germination from the seed bank. And another important caveat is that secondary invasion is a concern. It's always a concern when you're controlling an invasive species, especially in wetlands that, despite our best effort, are exposed to a lot of disturbance through both human activities and nutrient pollution, etc. And third conclusion is that more aerial insectivores, they do seem to be prefer to forage over the remnant uninvaded marsh or a marsh that was treated where Phragmites was suppressed and now is like shallow open water marsh. And this may be because there's more emerging invertebrates available for them, more prey items. And just some future considerations that is that the suppression of Phragmites, it does require follow-up for multiple years so that you don't get to that same landscape level spread extent, but a significant population reduction is absolutely possible. And we can see there's almost immediate positive responses to removing Phragmites from the landscape if Phragmites has reached, again, that landscape level spread. In addition to what I'm sharing with you today, Bird Studies Canada has also found that wetland birds, especially wetland birds of conservation concern, they do have higher abundances after Phragmites has been removed from these marshes. And finally, one important thing to think about is that the eradication of an established invasive species is very, very challenging. I don't want to say impossible, but when you've reached the sort of spread that Phragmites has reached, especially on like a watershed level, it's incredibly difficult to completely eradicate it from your patch of land when there's so much propagule pressure from outside of it, and there are so many other factors that you can't directly control. However, this work indicates that we can suppress populations down to what I'm referring to as an ecologically benign level, which is you can adequately suppress it or control it on your populations, in your wetland, for example, keep that population low, do some follow-up so it doesn't get to that large landscape level again. And we know that this will be beneficial for our native wetland species. So really the whole takeaway is, yes, it's challenging to control an established invasive species. It's challenging to undergo restoration, but it absolutely is worth it. And I put together some materials here just to leave up. I have a website. You can follow me on Twitter or email me. And these are just a couple of peer-reviewed or in-review papers if you're interested in reading more. If you don't have access to them, please email me. I'm always super happy to talk about this stuff and share it with folks.
Thanks so much, Courtney. We have time for one question, and just a reminder that there will be a Q&A period at the end where you can ask more questions as well. So I'll give you a couple seconds to post a question in the Q&A box. I think we also have one in the chat. Yes, from Angela. What do you think the impact of climate change has been in relation to Phragmite growth and abundance?
like in North America or just in the future?
I guess we could talk about North America.
Sure. So there's been a little bit of research from what I've read about essentially it's expected that Phragmites will continue to do very well with climate change, with increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, for example. So it looks like with changes related to climate change, it will probably, if anything, assist with its growth and spread. So Phrag is very good at adapting to anything we can throw at it. It really thrives off sort of human disturbances, which is kind of why it's so challenging to deal with. But yeah, there's been a little bit of work in terms of it will probably respond fairly positively to changes associated with climate change.
Okay, great. There's another question in the Q&A box and one in the chat, if you don't mind answering those, Courtney. And like I said, we'll have a period for engagement at the end where you can address all of the panelists.
Sure.
So thank you so much, Courtney. And with that, I'll hand it over to Angela to introduce our final speaker for today.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Courtney. It was really great to learn more about the Phrag. I want to say thank you again for all of the attendees for joining us and engaging with all the important research we have been learning more about today. It's been a pleasure to have you all here. So last but certainly not least, we will be introducing our sixth student spotlight, Samantha Meltretter. The title of Samantha's session is Weaving Anishinaabe Knowledge and Western Science to Understand Manoman Decline on the Upper Winnipeg River. Samantha is a water resources engineer in training with an interest in the social and environmental impacts of engineering. She completed her Bachelor's of Engineering in 2015 and subsequently worked in coastal engineering for 2 years before pursuing graduate studies. Samantha is currently working on her PhD in water resource engineering at the University of Guelph. Sam enjoys running, hiking, and scuba diving, and while indoors prefers to spend time wood burning or practicing her modern calligraphy. Most of all, Sam loves being on the water and is very excited to be doing her doctoral research in such a beautiful part of Canada. Perfect. Over to you, Samantha. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for the great introduction, Angela. I'm just going to get my screen shared, make sure that all works. Okay. Oh, sorry, I've got a few different screens going at the moment. That's okay. So thank you everyone for being here today, and I apologize, my screen is not where I wanted it to be. I might have to do this again. Sorry for the delay. Okay. Is it sharing? Sorry.
Yep, it's sharing. It's on the notes view though.
Oh. That's funny because I don't have the notes view.
Oh, perfect. I think if you just press begin presentation, then it'll work.
Begin presentation. Is that working or is it still
That's perfect? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. Okay, so thank you so much for everybody for being here and for, it was great to listen to some of the previous speakers and the keynotes earlier today. I'm so happy to be finishing us off and quite natural coming after Courtney, as she mentioned that wild rice was one of the plants that was growing in after they removed some of their Phragmites or in some of the treatment plots. And actually wild rice or monomen is what I'm going to be speaking about today. So I will get right into it. So just an overview quickly. I'm going to provide you with a little bit of background and context on the research project itself, and then get into the Monomen Research Project, how it was developed, how it kind of came into existence, as well as the methodologies that we're using. I'm only in my second year of my PhD, and so a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you is more approach. I have some preliminary results to share, but there's a lot more to come forward or to come as I go through the rest of my studies. So my research takes place in what is now Northwestern Ontario. It's the lands of the Ojibwe people in Treaty Number 3. So as you can see in my little inset map, we're just outside of the Great Lakes Basin, quite near Lake Superior. If anybody knows where Kenora is, it's very close to the Manitoba border. And so the site that I'm looking at is just north of Kenora. It's the lands of Nissechuan and Anishinaabe Nation, and they are along the Winnipeg River, which is a 300-kilometer long river that drains a large international water body called Lake of the Woods, and drains it into Lake Winnipeg. So funny enough, the Winnipeg River does not actually go through Winnipeg at all. But going back to monomen, I use the word monomen because it's the Anishinaabe-Moan word for what we now often call wild rice in English. But I want to have this word become more commonly used in our vocabulary as opposed to using the English word, since it is such an important and traditional food source to the Anishinaabe people. But monomen, or if we're using its scientific Latin name, Zizania palustris, is an annual aquatic grass that also is a complex carbohydrate that has long supported the diet of the Anishinaabe people in this area, with their diet in primarily lean proteins like fish. Monomen grows in the shallow lakes and rivers of kind of the central North America primarily, although it historically was all around North America. And many of you may have heard of monomen conflicts in and around the Peterborough area. So there is some in Southern Ontario as well. But what's important to recognize is this is not the same as the traditional white rice that you might be used to coming from Asia. Monomen is native to North America. And I alluded to this a little bit, but monomen has particular cultural significance to the Anishinaabe people. It translates roughly to spirit berry, and they hold it in very high regard and recognize its spiritual significance and see it as a gift from the creator. There are traditional stories of how the Anishinaabe people came to this part of Turtle Island and were led here in order to access monomen as a food source. And the other piece that brings its importance to the Anishinaabe people and to Nissechuan is its economic value. So once settlers arrived in this part of Turtle Island, they were able to trade and later sell monomen in order to access more resources, and that generated some economic value to this crop as well. A bit about monomen ecology though, this is a very sensitive plant, particularly to water levels, but also to sediment chemistry and competition with perennials. Monomen is an annual plant, and so it goes through an annual cycle. Annual life cycle. Starting from germination, it starts from germination each year. And this is in part why water levels are so important to monomen growth. If the water level is too high, then there often isn't enough light to get down to to the small submerged plant in order to allow it to grow to the surface and photosynthesize and further grow and ripen. Once fully matured though, monomen can grow several feet above the water's surface. And unfortunately, if water levels are dropped rapidly, especially on a regulated river, these stalks can break. But on the flip side, if the water levels rise too quickly, you can actually uproot the plant itself because the root system is quite shallow and isn't always very strong because it's often situated in pretty soft organic sediment. So because monomen is so sensitive to water levels, it's important to recognize all of the regulation along the Winnipeg River, and realize that dams like the Norman Dam and the Kenora Dam, which control the outflow of Lake of the Woods into the Winnipeg River, have greatly impacted, or is presumed to have greatly impacted monomen on the Winnipeg River. Then later in the 1950s, White Dog Falls Generating Station was built to power the pulp and paper mill in Kenora. And so these have greatly changed the water level patterns along the Winnipeg River. And as a consequence, Nissetuan and Anishinaabe Nation associate the loss of monomen on the Winnipeg River with the installation of these dams. Now, granted, there may be other factors playing into this, and that's part of what my research is all about, is figuring out what factors are affecting this loss of monomen. But what's important to recognize is that Nissetuan identified this issue and have been speaking of this issue for decades. And there's been very little attention brought to them. And so that's where we come in, is trying to help raise their voice and bring to the attention of the people who regulate the rivers and government authorities that their sacred and very valuable monomen crop has been influenced by changes on the Winnipeg River. And we need to work to restore this, as it's brought food insecurity to NAN, or to Nissetuan and Anishinaabe Nation, who's already quite an impoverished community. So then that brings me to the Monomen Research Project. It's important to kind of identify or go through our different team members, because I think that that's really what makes our team so unique and so interesting. The project was brought to light by Nissetuan elders. And so Nissetuan and Anishinaabe Nation is an important team member of this project. They've collaborated now with us at the University of Guelph, and we actually have representation from both the College of Arts through the Department of History, as well as the School of Engineering. So we have a very diverse and interdisciplinary team working on this project, which poses challenges, but also poses some really beautiful opportunities. So I wanted to share a bit of our workflow, and we've really been trying to figure this out as we go, being even just from the interdisciplinary aspect of two groups of University of Guelph researchers working together. We regularly struggle with vocabulary and different terms to use. Again, a lot of fun, but sometimes very challenging. And then to also have the diversity of academics, both Indigenous identified academics and settler identified academics, and Nissetuan and Anishinaabe themselves, who have an entirely different set of knowledge and experience. It's really important that we try and collaborate as much as possible and avoid some of this kind of divide and conquer mentality. But I do want to highlight again that Nissetuan is who they identified the problem initially. So this is very much community-driven research. Since then, the entire team has undergone site reconnaissance, which I'll share a little bit about later. We've identified our research objectives and project scoping, and from there we've gone into what I like to call our knowledge cycle. So we'll develop our steps, go through archival information, literature, instrumental data, conduct interviews with Szechuan elders, and then eventually do field sampling and actually get to learn from Monoman itself in the environment and in its habitat. The University of Guelph team members then preliminarily bring together that information and synthesize it. And then we share that with the community. And instead of the traditional academics doing all of the interpretation of results and then just telling the community what the case is, we're really trying to co-construct meaning. So we're bringing all of the information in a way to in-person information or knowledge sharing opportunities so that we can co-construct meaning and then move forward into developing our next steps and moving forward. Eventually, we hope to create some strategies that will hopefully restore Monoman on the Upper Winnipeg River and test those strategies as well, which from there, I imagine will move back into this knowledge cycle. But I wanted to share not only the cyclical nature of our research workflow, but also how involved all of the different partners in our team are working together on different aspects of the research. The site reconnaissance portion of our research, which really took over 2 years, and I'm calling it the site reconnaissance just because it was the time that we, as researchers who are based in Southern Ontario, would travel to Szechuan and Anishinaabe Nation and travel to Monoman ancestral fields, was really, really valuable in terms of, for myself as a water resources engineer in training, it's always important for me to see the sites that I'm working with, to actually see and be among Monoman. But more importantly, it was meeting the people and developing that relationship. Further, the Szechuan and Anishinaabe Nation identified the ancestral sites that they've entrusted us to study in. And we've also used this opportunity to develop a culturally sensitive field protocol so that we are working with Monoman, who is considered a spirited being among the Anishinaabe in an ethical way. We do have several research objectives, but today I'm really going to focus on just our first one as an example of how we weave together different knowledge systems. So the 3 different knowledge systems or pieces or sources of knowledge that we used for this part of the research are archival documents, including newspapers and government reports, as well as other Monoman research, some interviews with Szechuan elders that Dr. Luby conducted over summers of 2018 and 2019, as well as hydrometric data that's available from the Water Survey of Canada, so primarily water level data that actually goes back into the early 20th century. The other piece I want to mention here is that there are strengths and limitations to each of these different types of knowledge. And what's important in weaving together different types of knowledge is not seeing one as more valid or less valid than the other, and recognizing that each has its limits and each has its strengths. And we try and highlight our strengths in weaving together knowledge. Coming from an engineering background, a lot of this weaving knowledge systems together was very new to me. And I'm sure it's very new to many people because it hasn't been commonly used. But I've really found it helpful to draw from other researchers and their approaches to weaving knowledge in an ethical way. The guiding principles, this is actually from a report from the University of Guelph. I felt like their 7 R's guiding principles are really helpful and really kind of struck a chord and resonated with me, especially reciprocity. And I kind of alluded to this, but recognizing that each way of knowing acts on its own, is independent, and is just as important as another, which is often not the view. Sometimes we see Western science as more valid, and this really challenges that, and that it's just a different way of knowing a system and it's equally as valid. Another approach I've drawn from is the multiple evidence-based approach. This contrasts using parallel knowledge systems with integrating knowledge. Integrating can be a bit of a problematic term because it often recognizes one type of knowledge system as more important than another. And so you're validating one system with another. Whereas with parallel knowledge systems, we're recognizing that each is a different manifestation of valid and useful knowledge, and you're using them in parallel and then bringing them together to enrich, to create a more enriched understanding. And then when you bring them together, you can use approaches like triangulation. Sorry, did someone come on? Am I running over time? No, okay. But we use triangulation to look for converging lines of evidence amongst the different types of knowledge, synergies, as well as discrepancies, and highlighting that discrepancies are just as important as the converging lines of evidence, because it encourages you to dig deeper and gain a better insight and understanding to the system and to all of the knowledge that's being presented. Usually using visuals is very helpful. So I really liked this paper by Abu, Reed, and Jardine, where they actually use Venn diagrams to indicate where the synergies, discrepancies are located. So quickly, I'll try and share some results. I've created a bit of a timeline because this helped me visualize what was happening, because really a lot of the actions along the Winnipeg River that have impacted Mahnomen started before the 1900s, so over about almost 150 years ago. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by the questions being posted. So to give you a sense, I've already introduced when many of the dams were installed, but there have also been other hydraulic changes to the Winnipeg River, and many of the rapids were blown out, which greatly changes how the system moves. We also have several long records of hydrometric data, which is very, very fortunate. You can see on this map where some of the gauges are. This star is where Nissequan and Anishinaabe Nations Reserve is. They're located on a channel that's called the Dalles. And then there's several gauges around that area. However, they each have different lengths. I do want to draw your attention to 05PE009. So that gauge in particular is quite long. It extends back to 1913 and is in a railway town called Manaki. So again, a settler town. So if we plot some of these, I'm just going to quickly plot. We have several different hydrometric data sets. You'll notice that the one at the Dalles, so at Nissequan and Anishinaabe Nation, is quite short. And then I've also been able to find data that actually indicates how long or how much Mahnomen harvest has been conducted over the last several years. They're quite spotty at times, but they do provide some information towards the relationships between water levels and Mahnomen harvest. So unfortunately, I won't be able to go through some of the details here. I've gone a little bit over, but essentially what I'm showing in these images are bringing in quotes from interviews as well as pieces from archival information and mapping them on top of our water level data. And this way I can start to look at trends and really understand how water levels are impacting Mahnomen growth from a historic perspective. So I will quickly wrap up. What I really wanted to get across in this presentation was that there's tremendous value in weaving together knowledge systems and that it's a very delicate process. I still have a lot to learn and a lot to understand about this system, but I'm very excited for that moving forward. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Samantha. That was really great. And we have one question for you in the chat, and then I think we're going to move on to the larger Q&A period. But can you expand more on your experience with intertwining social science methodologies within your engineering and natural science-based background?
Yeah, absolutely. So this has really been a fun part of the research for me. I've always been very interested in different disciplines and interdisciplinary research. At one point, I thought about doing a degree in history. And it's been very interesting, but it also is very humbling. And I think that's been an important part of it, is recognizing that I might know a lot about my field, but I know very, very little about someone else's, and recognizing that and owning that has been really important to the process. The other piece that's been really important is not being afraid to ask what might be considered a stupid question. I know people say there's no such thing, but sometimes that does come through and you're embarrassed to ask these questions. We've been able to create a relationship amongst our different researchers that, you know, there's no question that's off limits. And I think that's been really important. We also often will use phrases to check in and say, does that feel good to you? Does that, is that okay with you? Does that wording work for you? And that's been a really important piece. But I would definitely recommend, if anybody has the opportunity to work in an interdisciplinary team, especially more of a classic science, like natural science with a social science, it's amazing. It's a lot of fun.
That's great, thank you. So we have time now for about a 10 or 15 minute Q&A period for the entire group. We have a couple questions lined up for the panelists already. Just a reminder that you can also ask questions of our keynotes. So you can ask Carrie Ann and Dawn questions as well. Just be sure that whether you're posting in the chat or the Q&A box, that you indicate who the question is for, and that will really help us out a lot. So I'm going to start off the question and answer period. For the first question is from Sean Rudd, and it's for Courtney. And he said, really interesting to hear the positive results of the control of Phragmites. For the protected wetlands in the Southern Ontario region you addressed, how important is the control or regeneration of this species versus other ecological priorities?
Sure. So I'm going to assume those protected wetlands he's referring to are Rondo and Long Point, as opposed to other protected wetlands in Southern Ontario. I would say in Long Point especially, it's a really high priority to control Phragmites. I didn't get into it with the maps, but in some areas of the marsh, about 70% of it has been converted to just dense stands of Phragmites. And these are really, they're rare ecosystems. They're really special ecosystems that we have protected from development, that there's sort of, if we lose them, there's nowhere else for them to go. Like they can't, there's kind of a road, the peninsula can't like shift. It's, so I would say it's actually a fairly high priority there to get that population under control. It's of course not the only priority. Everything we do should always be acknowledging the system that we're working in. But in those marshes in particular, Frag had really altertered them. And it was something that was sort of a clear step forward to improve the habitat for native species. I hope that answers kind of what you were thinking of.
That's great, thank you. From Nick Brunet, and this is for Sam. We have another question. What are some key lessons, take homes for conservation authority staff and managers in terms of your research?
Hi, and thank you so much for the question. I appreciate it. I was just about to type it in, but I'd say that the take home, namely for conservation authority staff and managers of my research, is recognizing the value in different knowledge systems, especially when making decisions about these complex ecological and social systems. I think we've in the past had a tendency to make decisions without really considering these systems as a whole. And as a result, there are downstream effects, as in the case of the area I'm working in. And I think to really ensure that we're meeting as many of the needs as possible of different groups, including environmental systems and ecological systems, we need to draw as much information as we can and not hold one knowledge system higher than another.
That's great, thank you. For Ryan, I have a question. Thank you so much for emphasizing the importance of decolonizing conservation in Canada. Can you expand on the adoption of an ethical space approach and what that would entail?
So my experience with ethical space is primarily in a research essence. So I haven't actually seen it in use per se. But the way that I understand it from the We Rise Together document is that it's kind of a basic sense of creating relationships with people that you're collaborating with. And yes, the documents like treaties, UNDRIP, TRC are important background information to that, and they frame the idea of ethical space. But entering into ethical space for collaborations is not because of those documents. It's within that framework. So as far as I understand it, it's a matter of creating relationships of respect and reciprocity rather than a requirement.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. We do have a couple of questions for the group, so anyone can jump in and answer, and they're kind of just final takeaway questions that we wanted to ask.
Sorry, Jess. It would be great if everyone could, all the panelists could turn their mics and videos on so that we could just have more of an interactive discussion too for the final moments of our symposium. Thank you.
Yeah, and Dawn and Carrie Ann, please feel free to jump in as well. But our final couple questions, the first one is, what is your vision for a more inclusive and diverse future within conservation research?
I don't want to well, I guess I'm jumping in first, but it's been a while since I've spoken, so I'm wondering if my voice still works. But you mentioned these questions before the event, and I started thinking about them and had a bit of time to sort of process it throughout the event and think about it as we learn from everyone who spoke. And thanks again, everyone who did. And I think, to me, when we talk about diversity and research and research teams, and thinking about the concepts of EDI, for example, equity, diversity, and inclusion, oftentimes you'll see the conversations start about bringing these diverse voices to the table. So whether that's making room for BIPOC scholars in your research team, or considering these different worldviews. And what I've seen happen far more often than not is that this conversation ends at the recruitment stage. And so it's not about how does this conversation continue throughout every stage of a research project, for example, or about during conversations about conservation. It's sort of, how do we bring these voices to the table? And I think it needs to shift for me into recognizing this conversation belongs throughout all the processes, whether it's like initial consultations or collaborations through to decision making and implementation and monitoring. So that also includes breaking down barriers that currently exist for people in these spaces, whether they're BIPOC voices or LGBTQ+ voices, making sure that these people feel, while there may be efforts made to recruit them and bring them into the conversation, that once they're in the conversation, their worldviews, perspectives, and ideas are valid and validated through everyone's conversations. And that, I feel like, sometimes is forgotten a bit.
Thanks, Brady.
Just piggybacking off of what Brady said, I think definitely a lot of truth in the importance of making the space for people to share their differences in ideas and different opinions and different ways of knowing, because I think sometimes it's great to check off, we check off the box to say that someone's been included and we have a diverse team, but it's another thing entirely to make their voices heard and available, and making that space. And I think I alluded to it a little bit with the one question about my experience with interdisciplinary research, but so much of it is about humility and not seeing your way of knowing and your background as superior to another's, and really changing that mentality so that you are open to someone else's worldviews and recognizing that.
Yeah, and I think related to that, Sam, I think a lot of it is we need to maybe change the metrics that we evaluate people as being successful by, to create more space for those different ways of knowing the world, and to recognize that, as Carrie Ann kind of talked about and other folks have touched on, that we are not, humans aren't separate. There's a lot of, especially as like a settler, and a lot of in my education was, so here's the ecological world, here's the environment as resources to extract, or a preserved wild place where people are not a part of it. And I think we need to have a major shift to seeing humans as like integral to these systems, and that there are multiple ways of knowing, and that formal education isn't the only way of knowing things. And I think we can only really have that if we start also radically inspecting the kind of metrics that we consider as important, or giving people credentials, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Courtney. In my bio, I said something along the lines of that conservation needs to be more of a mindset, not just something that we do in very specific areas. And I truly believe that. And I think that is something that Indigenous-led conservation can bring to the table. So I guess when I think of diversity, I'm kind of along the same lines there, of thinking of diversity of not just individuals of diverse backgrounds, but a diversity of worldviews and knowledge systems that inform our decisions going forward. Specifically diversifying from colonial views of what it means to conserve or protect an area.
I'll just jump in there. So I completely agree with what everyone has said. For me, I think my research is a bit different, as you may have picked up. Like, it has a lot of the history component to it. For me, I think diversity is honestly truth. I remember in my undergrad, I had a class on research methods, which was actually really practical, but it was about how history is told and how research is like a picture frame with everything you want to express being inside of it. So that's just always kind of stuck with me in terms of navigating power relations and biases. So I think diversity is to be aware of your curated picture frame, and then understand why it looks the way that it does, and then actively working to improve upon it.
That's a really great summary. Thank you. And I was just going to add onto that, like a lot of us, especially as a white woman, I acknowledge I have a lot of privilege, and that others face very severe systemic barriers to inclusion in the science and conservation community. And that really mindful change needs to happen, both at the individual level, but also at the organizational level, to recognize these biases and I think, like Ryan was saying, not only in like recruitment stages, but also further career and developing mentorship programs and acknowledging kind of these ways to incorporate diversity, not only into our individual projects, but also into our institutions, in order to, actively promote diversity.
Thank you so much. I don't know, Carrie Ann or Dawn, if you want to jump in before we wrap up.
Sure, I guess I'll say a few words. I really would like to say that I'm very impressed with all the presentations today, and very humbled by all of the presentations and the inclusion of the Indigenous voices in those. But I also want to just remind everybody that, as I said in my opening keynote, that we're all people and we all have gifts to give. But I also want to remind everybody that the history that we are all learning about together, that is not, the history that a lot of us grew up to know and believe in, is a history that is not of our making. And this is an opportunity for us to be able to move forward in a very inclusive, diverse way. And I just want to say Chumigwach for all of you guys for really striving to understand that and to make a better future for us all, including our relatives that are not of the human being. Chumigwach.
I could add one thing, Jessica, before we clue up. Thanks, Carrie Ann, for your thoughts. And it's so interesting talking about and seeing the panelists that come from such a wide range of disciplines and experiences and lived experiences. and recognizing how important that notion of interdisciplinary research or multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, whatever the word you want to use, you know, these concepts that span disciplinary boundaries in conservation specifically, given, you know, the context that we're in, especially in Canada. When you look at, and I had a question for Ryan earlier that, you know, we can connect about maybe later, but it's interesting to talk about conservation and Indigenous-led conservation that's seeing a bit of a resurgence, while also at the same time seeing the continued criminalization of Indigenous peoples who are asserting their rights, you know, such as the Wet'suwet'en people in BC, fighting back against the Coastal GasLink project, the Mi'kmaq fishers in Nova Scotia who are asserting their rights as traditional, for their traditional livelihood. So it's this, you know, it spans, while we talk about, you know, the environmental sector and conservation, that goes hand in hand with things like the justice system, and these ideas that, you know, we can't promote the resurgence of Indigenous-led conservation without addressing the systemic racism and things that exist in the criminal justice system that prevent or, you know, continue to oppress Indigenous peoples in their assertion of their rights and these sort of ideas. So when we talk about interdisciplinarity, I think it's super important to recognize that wherever you come from, there's a space for you in the conversation around conservation, and moving that forward.
It's Don. I just would like again to echo comments about wonderful presentations, and just to say that I think that Art Latornell would be incredibly impressed, not just by the quality of the presentations, but the innovative work that's being done, and also, again, the realization that we're not going to move forward until we change our attitudes around our relationship to the environment and Indigenous people as well, who have very important lessons and messages that we really need to pay attention to. So congratulations to the presenters. Wish you luck in your future studies, and pleased to have listened to all the presentations this morning.
Okay, with that, I think we will wrap up the Q&A period. I just want to echo everyone's thoughts and say thank you to our keynotes and thank you to all of our panelists today. I personally feel like I've learned a lot, and we had such a diversity of presenters and presentation topics. Typically, the Latornell Symposium takes place in person and is a 3-day event at the Nottawasaga Inn. And so there's been a lot of adaptation this year, and it's great to see how adaptable you've all been, and to kind of create this wonderful space where we're all able to share and learn together. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nick to say our final remarks. Thank you.
Well, I was just going to say thank you, but I have a long list of thank yous to acknowledge, obviously, keynotes, presenters, those who came and stayed for the entire time. Thank you so much. A special thank you to AllSet Inc. and Mario in particular, who is behind the scenes managing all this and doing a phenomenal job. Conservation Ontario, and I should plug that instead of the symposium this year, there's something called the Leadership Project that we're taking on, and I'd love you to keep an eye out for those events, which are periodic workshops that are really phenomenal, bringing in experts in all sorts of different fields and very applied stuff. I'd also like to thank the Latornell Endowment at the University of Guelph and the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development and the OAC for their ongoing support of my work and my professorship, as well as the Rob Corey and Janet Ivey that reviewed the presentations today. They reviewed all the applications, about, I don't know how many of them anymore, but were the ones who made that selection. So thank you very much to those two. And to all of you, thank you for attending. We hope you enjoyed, and we hope to see you next year in person. Thank you so much. Chimagwech.